control, shoveling dirt in every hole. Predators to condemn your soul, watching you and watching me. We're all connected but separated, misunderstood and so frustrated. A million armies of one have invaded, watching you and watching me. We live behind glass curtains and act like nothing's wrong. Soon you will belong. I know you're out there somewhere. We've watched you for so long. Wait for you to fall. We'll expose you all. I know you're out there somewhere watching me. Little brother wants to make headlines, be immortalized. Everyone's got an electric eye with the digital spies. They've watched you for so long. I know you're out there somewhere watching me. We the people have taken over. We the people are little brother, standing by to dethrone each other, watching you and watching me. Paranoid, the lens is our weapon, desensitized in our lust for attention, democratized by our voyeur obsessions, watching you and watching me. Slaves to perfection, don't let them project you as you are. Feel your every flaw. I know you're out there somewhere. We've watched you for so long. Wait for you to fall. We'll expose you all. I know you're out there somewhere watching me. Little brother wants to make headlines, be immortalized. Everyone's got an electric eye with the digital spies. They've watched you for so long. I know you're out there somewhere watching me. Stay in line, don't make a mistake. We're watching. We watched you for so long. We wait for you to fall. We will expose you all. I know you're out there somewhere watching
let your experience begin right now. From high atop the mountains of British Columbia to you listening around the world, this is Spaced Out Radio. You can follow us on our website, spacedoutradio.com, on Twitter, @SpacedOutRadio. Give our Facebook page a like, Spaced Out Radio Show. You can follow us on Instagram, Dave Scott, SOR, or on our YouTube channel, Spaced Out Radio Show.
Superman, that we're the only ones who can be strong, but we break on command, cause women rule the world.
Buckle up, space travelers. It's time to go for a ride as we are live on Spaced Out Radio.
Ignition sequence start. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Said the deeper I go, the deeper I fall.
Good evening and welcome to Space Out Radio. Tonight I am your host, Dave Scott, joined by Eric Markham, and it's good to have you along for the ride wherever you are on this great planet we call Earth. We are live right here, right now in Uncle Jimbo's cabin in the Great White North on this Wednesday night, early Thursday morning if you're on the East Coast. Let's welcome in everyone listening in on SpaceOutRadio.com, on Spreaker, on the United Public Radio Network, the High Plains Talk Radio Network, and on Revolution Radio. As we do this thing every night of the week, rocking in and out of every show, thanks to our resident guitar god, Mr. Ron Bumblefoot THAL, formerly of Guns N' Roses. Bumblefoot is the official sound of SOR. You can also follow us all over social media on Twitter @SpacedOutRadio. Give our Facebook page a like, Spaced Out Radio Show. On Instagram, I can be followed at Dave Scott, SOR. Subscribe to our YouTube channel, Spaced Out Radio Show. Find us on TuneIn. Download our shows and others from iTunes, and our website, of course, is spacedoutradio.com. Hey, if you want to take part in this show, you will have to sign into one of the chat rooms on Revolution Radio, on Spreaker, on the United Public Radio chat room, and on Facebook at the SOR Space Travelers Club. Or, if you're on Twitter, just go to hashtag Spaced Out Radio, and I will get your questions in there as well. If you haven't signed up for the SOR Space Travelers Club yet, guess what? It's time. It's cheap. We do it for you. It's only $5 a month, and with that, your name gets entered into monthly prize draws. You get access to private group interviews, access to a special section on our website, and a heck of a lot more. While on our website, tour around, take a perusing. Read up on my latest blog. Check out Eric Markham's SOR Spacewire for your latest and weird news. And if you have a sighting that you just can't explain, do me a favor, fill out an SOR Sightlines report. UFOs, Bigfoot, ghosts, doesn't matter. Our researcher, Mike Schmidt, is ready to find out what's going on. All personal information is 100% confidential. Hey, we want to thank everyone listening in on our newest affiliate, the United Public Radio Network, live on 107.7 FM in New Orleans, and their listeners from over 160 countries around the world. Thank you for tuning in to us. And remember, if you're listening in on Revolution Radio, the Double R Machine is the largest nonprofit online radio station going today. Do us a favor, take the time to visit freedomslips.com and donate today. Howard Phillips Lovecraft lived a very short life, as he was only 46 when he passed away. But in his short time, he left a lifetime of cult followers and intrigue. Yes, we could say H.P. Lovecraft was decades ahead of the game when it came into writing and basically creating the horror genre. In a time in the early 20th century where gore and freak shows were kind of frowned upon, Lovecraft was the one who stood the test of time and the hurricane-force winds of anger and religious threats. Virtually unknown and published only in pulp magazines before he died in poverty, he is now regarded as one of the most significant 20th century authors of his genre. Lovecraft was born in Providence, Rhode Island, where he spent most of his life. Among his most celebrated tales are The Call of Cthulhu and The Shadows over Innsmouth, both canonical and Cthulhu mythos. And tonight, author and Lovecraft aficionado St. Joshi comes into Spaced Out Radio to talk about the importance of Lovecraft's work in defining a darker, hidden side of humanity. His award-winning biography called H.P. Lovecraft, A Life, published in 1996, launched Joshi into the most foremost researcher on the creativity of the man who died way too young. Joshi's website is stjoshi.org, and tonight I'm also being joined by SOR Space Wire's Eric Markham, who is literally co-hosting with me tonight, and a die-hard H.P. Lovecraft fan. So we welcome in Eric and ST. Eric, how you doing?
Doing fine. Got a little bit of a chest cold, but I'm appropriately dosed.
Excellent. Excellent. And Mr. Joshi, good to have you on Spaced Out Radio tonight. How are you?
I'm good. Right here in somewhat chilly Seattle.
Chilly?
I'm
about 7 hours north of you. And
yeah.
we just hit our high for the day of minus 15 degrees Celsius.
Well, we're not quite that bad, of course, but getting in the mid-30s Fahrenheit is regarded as pretty cold for Seattle.
Yes, indeed. I moved up this north a year ago. I made the decision, ST, that I was literally going to give up the rain of Vancouver through Seattle and move up north and sacrifice the rain for the cold winters. But the problem was this summer was the most rain in the area in the last 30 years. So I gained nothing.
Well, Mr. Lovecraft would not like the cold. He was very sensitive to cold and couldn't stir outside the house, if it was like 20 or 30 above freeze, Fahrenheit. He would actually pass out and go unconscious, might die. He came close to dying when he was out the cold in New York City one day, and had to be dragged into a drugstore and warmed up. He had some sort of, nobody knows what it was. He had some sort of condition where he couldn't keep up his body temperature in the cold.
He might have had I'm a lab rat. I work in a hospital lab, and we get people who have a cold autoimmune blood disorder, and their blood actually starts to clot up if it goes below a certain temperature. Blood banking wasn't as fine an art and science back then, so it probably would have gone undiagnosed. But yeah, it sounds like he had his own cold antibody, which would have been a nightmare for any blood banker trying to work up a cross match for him.
ST, I want to get this thing started as I always do with my audience. I like to get to know and have them get to know a little bit about you. What made you focus on H.P. Lovecraft and the importance? How did you get into this?
Well, I was born in India, so I'm an immigrant. I came here with my family when I was 5 years old, settled in the Midwest. My parents were both professors, and so I've always had a sort of books all around me, education, things like that. But I wasn't interested in reading until I was about 10, 11, 12 years old, maybe, and then my older sister dragged me to the public library saying, "You better start reading books, guy. You're getting behind here." So I took to fantasy first. It's funny because one of the first things that really got me reading was C.S. Lewis's Chronicles of Narnia, which are just fascinating, fantasy adventure stories. I didn't at that time understand the heavy Christian symbolism underlying them because I didn't know anything about Christianity, frankly. But anyway, that got me reading. But I gravitated then toward horror. I think I read Edgar Allan Poe at a pretty early age. Read some of these other anthologies that people like Rod Serling and Alfred Hitchcock had compiled for young adults, and those were sort of fun. And then one day I was just strolling through my public library. This is in Muncie, Indiana. I would have been about 12, 13 probably. I can't remember exactly, but I found these books by H.P. Lovecraft, and I said, this guy sounds kind of interesting. I hadn't really heard of him, but the titles of these books seemed kind of up my alley. Now, the funny thing is, I started reading this long novella that he wrote called At the Mountains of Madness, one of his most famous works. It was Guillermo del Toro, I hope, will make into a movie someday, set in Antarctica. But the thing is, it was difficult. I just couldn't get it. It was way above me, because I at that time I knew very little about science. Actually, I still don't know a whole lot about science, but that story was particularly heavy on the science, and I couldn't get it. So I put it back. A couple of months later, I started another one of these books, and that did it for me. I mean, I was sold. I mean, this was, he just opened up a whole new world for me, and I just devoured everything I could, not only by him, but about him. Not that there was that much. We're talking about the early 70s here. I mean, he just became my whole world, and it was just an adventure.
Oh, that's kind of an interesting connection for us. When were you in Muncie? I was born there, believe it or not.
Really? That's amazing. I lived there. My parents, my mother taught at Ball State University for 40-odd years. I lived there for about 7 years. I went from 6th grade to 12th grade in Muncie, and then went to college, out in the East. But, so my formative years were in Muncie, Indiana.
So the appeal to the Great Spirit, and the local joke at the Indian was actually saying, "Please, Lord, let me get off this horse. I have to pee." I always knew we were within a few blocks of my grandmother's house when we'd come up to that square where the statue was.
Yeah, right.
Yeah,
Chief Muncie, or whoever he was.
Yeah, I think he was a fictitious character. I think they made him
maybe.
up for the... But, that's kind of cool. Yeah, I was born.
Yeah, but no, and I was allowed actually to use the library at Ball State University. Also, I could actually check out books on my mother's library card, and did a lot of stuff there. But and the public library at that time was a really good library. They had lots of stuff. These books by Lovecraft and other horror writers, anthologies. So yeah, I read a lot in that era.
He was very. I think that if Howard Phillips had lived to see the explosion in his popularity, he would be sitting there scratching his head, because he toiled in obscurity for most of his life. I mean, he ghost wrote for some of the famous people, but nobody really knew who was H.P. Lovecraft.
It's so tragic. I mean, he was. I mean, as Dave said at the beginning, he really was way ahead of his time. And he was writing. When he started seriously writing, late teens, 1920s or thereabouts, horror, was not really thought of as a respectable genre. This is when the pulp magazines were just starting, and they were regarded as, frankly, stuff for the working classes. I mean, for the lower classes. You bought these little magazines for a dime, 15 cents sometime, and they were the reading, material for, the working class. The upper class read people things like, Saturday Evening Post and Harper's Atlantic Monthly, where horror would never appear. I mean, it was just banned. So Lovecraft had no option but to appear in these cheap, crumbling pulp magazines, because where else are you going to get published?
Right. Amazing Stories was his main outlet.
Weird Tales was his main major mark. He did appear once or twice in Amazing Stories, but Weird Tales, that was the great horror pulp magazine of the day, and really an impressive magazine, at least for its longevity. I mean, it started in 1923, went on all the way up to 1954, which is really actually beyond the point when most other pulp magazines had already collapsed. So that longevity was impressive. I mean, it published a real mix of things, some really bad stuff, but some really outstanding stuff by Lovecraft, by Clark Ashton Smith, by some other writers, but very, very mixed bag.
I find it amazing that if you actually read his earliest, I've got the complete works, and so much of his early he was obviously channeling Poe or Lord Dunsany, and by the time you start getting into the Cthulhu mythos, the horror, there was this blooming of his own voice coming out, and I've always wondered, do you think he being sort of adrift like he was spiritually, do you think maybe he believed that his mythos was a possibility?
Oh no, by no means. I mean, he was he was a thoroughgoing materialist, skeptic, and atheist. I mean, he claimed he was an atheist from the age of 5. I'm not sure about that exactly, but he had some tangles with his Sunday school teachers. His mother tried to get him to go to Sunday school every now and then, and he always asked these embarrassing questions that they couldn't answer. But no, he was a diehard materialist, and for him, writing horror fiction, writing supernatural fiction was a creative outlet. It was meant to expand the imagination, and the creatures that he invented are really symbols. He never took them literally. And the funny thing was that every now and then he came across some fan of his or some reader who actually did take them literally. There's one strange fellow named William Lumley, whom he got in touch with later on in the 30s, and Lumley was convinced that Lovecraft was writing the truth about all these creatures, even though he didn't know it himself. And Lovecraft, humored this guy. He felt he was kind of an amusing eccentric, but no, he certainly didn't believe in his own creations in the literal sense.
Good. You touched upon exactly where I was going with that, because to this day, there is a diehard contingent of Lovecraft fans who are convinced that he was writing the truth, not just what was out of his mind.
Oh yeah, well the occultists got onto him as early as like the late 60s, 1970s. People like Kenneth Grant, I think he was an English guy, who wrote a number of treatises in which he had little chapters on Lovecraft, saying, yeah, all these creatures, these old ones, really, they're out there, and Lovecraft simply didn't know what he was writing. He was channeling this stuff, unconsciously or something like that. And that's all rubbish. The great thing about Lovecraft is he left enormous numbers of letters. He wrote thousands and thousands of letters to all kinds of different people, to other writers, but other people as well. And you learn so much about Lovecraft from those letters. He tells you everything about his life, everything about his beliefs, his outlook on life, politics. It's amazing. And so you learn so much about Lovecraft, and you can appeal to those letters, saying, okay, this is what he says here, and this is what he believes.
ST, it's Dave again, and I want to kind of get back to you here for a quick moment. Did you always have an interest in the horror genre or the dark side of writing before you got into writing about it yourself? Or was this something that because you fell in love with H.P. Lovecraft right away, that your focus just went bang, right on him?
Yeah, I think it actually came from Lovecraft. That is to say, I didn't really know much about horror fiction, aside from, standard writers like Poe or Ambrose Bierce, before I read Lovecraft. So I read Lovecraft, and then, of course, one of those 3 volumes that I mentioned, in the library, those are the so-called the Arkham House editions from the 1960s. They got most of Lovecraft's stories into 3 big volumes. But the 3rd volume, Dagon and Other Macabre Tales, also had this nonfiction piece that he wrote in the 20s called Supernatural Horror in Literature. It's this, a short, 50-page treatise about the whole history of horror fiction. And so I read that, and I said, oh my God, look at all these writers whom I'd never heard of, and whom Lovecraft seems to like a whole lot, so why don't I start exploring them? And I did. So it was really Lovecraft who took me not only to his predecessors, people like, Lord Dunsany, Arthur Machen, Algernon Blackwood, but all kinds of other writers. And then, of course, as I started reading Lovecraft, I began to realize that there were, other writers after him who were writing in his style or in his, following in his footsteps right up to the present day, people like Robert Bloch and Fritz Leiber and all sorts of other people. So, yeah, Lovecraft was kind of a fulcrum for me. He made me look back to the history of horror fiction and also forward to some of the people who were writing after him.
Did he have, back in the day, a cult following or people who were just wandering around aimlessly trying to find someone to latch onto, much like they did with Edgar Allan Poe? Or was he just someone who was so ominous and absent in society that in reality, like most artists, they're not famous until well after they've passed.
He had a wide circle of, colleagues, friends, correspondents. I mean, toward the end of his life, he says, I'm writing letters to like 100 different people, whether it be other writers like August Derleth or Robert Bloch or Robert E. Howard or, just fans who are interested in his work. He was quite popular with the magazine Weird Tales. If you read the letter column, that was published in each issue, you have every single issue has some, little letter saying, I love this latest story by Lovecraft. And in fact, then when Lovecraft died, fairly suddenly in 1937. I mean, he was ill for several years before he died, but he kept that illness kind of quiet, even from his closest friends. So a lot of them were shocked to learn that he just up and died, when he was 46 and a half years old. And then all the readers of Weird Tales were shocked, and they wrote in all these letters, in the next couple of months after his death. And some of them said something like, I feel as if I've lost, a relative of my own family. So it's amazing how Lovecraft, inspired this devotion just from his writings. I mean, it's hard to think of any other person who's done something like that.
For our audience who may not be familiar with who H.P. Lovecraft is, could you give us a synopsis of who he was, what he was all about?
Well, in my position, it's pretty hard to do since I know so much about him. But, okay, the short version is born 1890 in Providence, Rhode Island, and spent most of his life there, with the exception of a couple of years he spent in New York, where he got married unhappily and, lived there for a couple of years, and then came back to Providence. Died, as I say, March 1937. So 46 and a half years old. His literary career really spanned barely 2 decades. He started writing some stuff in 1914, mostly poetry and essays, started writing fiction in 1917. I mean, he'd written some fiction as a young kid, he was 6, 7 years old, but that's different. So from 1917 to 1937, that was his literary career, 2 decades only. And within that period, he only wrote maybe a total of 60 stories, some of them quite short, but some of them quite long. I mean, 3 of them may be close to novel length. They're very short novel length, really speaking. But most of them are sort of in that, what we call novellas or novelettes, 40, 50-page stories. Most of them published in Weird Tales. A few of them published in science fiction pulp magazines. Amazing stories, astounding stories. Never had a book of his stories published in his lifetime. It's amazing that somebody who is now so famous simply, never had a book published in his lifetime. He tried. He had, he solicited, or other publishers, solicited, book projects from him, but they never mounted anything. But the thing about Lovecraft is he did get in touch with all these other writers in his day who were writing, kind of the same stuff that he was. And it was the devotion of those writers that ultimately led to his success after his death, because 2 of them, August Derleth and Donald Wandrei, were so devoted to Lovecraft and so, stunned by his death, they said, we got to save his work. We got to preserve this stuff and get it out of the pulp magazines into book form. And they formed the publishing company, Arkham House Publishers, for the sole purpose, initially, of publishing Lovecraft, and they did. And then, that's eventually, decades later, Lovecraft took off. But, he was an old-time New Englander. As I say, he was an atheist, he was a materialist, he was well-read in the sciences, he knew a lot about science, even though he never went to college, in fact, didn't really ever graduate from high school. He actually was a high school dropout, incredibly enough, because he had a lot of health problems in his childhood, but he was a great reader. He just loved reading. He just read. He had a good library at home. He read everything he could find. So well-versed in the sciences, knew a lot about philosophy, very interested in current events. A lot of people don't realize that. They think he was just, some kind of recluse who shut himself up in his study, but he actually knew a lot about what was going on, in the 20s and 30s. And some of his most interesting letters are talking about current events. But, he was unworldly in the sense that he didn't like marketing himself. He didn't like putting himself out there and selling his work for money. He felt that was it's kind of beneath him. He had these sort of aristocratic attitudes about, a gentleman doesn't write for money. But then, if you're a gentleman, you better have some other source of income. If you're not going to write for money, and he didn't really. The best he could do was this revision work for people. So he lived in pretty dire poverty for most of his life. And it's, as we've mentioned, it's amazing. He would be more amazed than anybody at his worldwide success today.
Yeah, it seems like once his grandfather, who was more or less his father was the traveling salesman that was never home, and eventually, if I remember right, contracted syphilis and died rather unmourned in a sanitarium somewhere. But it seems like his grandfather was a rich industrialist, Whipple
Phillips, yeah. I mean, see, that's the thing. Lovecraft grew up as fairly well-to-do circumstances. His family had this huge house. I wouldn't quite call it a mansion, but it was a big house in Providence, Rhode Island, 3 stories. Unfortunately, that house is no longer standing. It was torn down a while ago, but he loved that house. Just rambled all around, and they had plenty of money. They had servants. Had 5 different servants. He could remember their names decades later, but the grandfather suffered various financial setbacks. He had some difficulties of his own. He was kind of I wouldn't say a speculator exactly, but, he had some troubles. And so when he died in 1904, and Lovecraft was only 14, apparently his estate was mismanaged, and therefore they lost a lot of money, and the surviving, relatives, namely Lovecraft and his mother and his 2 aunts, really had very little to live on, and they somehow managed to get by for the rest of their lives on a very small income. And Lovecraft never learned or never developed an occupation. He didn't feel he had to earn a living. But hey, if you don't have any money, you better figure out how to earn a living, and he never did really. So he felt that somehow literature could be his income, but it really never was. He never wrote enough to make a living as a writer, and the work was not saleable in the sense that that he could just toss off something and get some money for it. So it was pretty dire situation, especially toward the end of his life.
Oh yeah, with his fear of doctors, but with medical science being what it was back then, even had he gone to a doctor, they probably would just prescribed laudanum and enemas. Or
yeah, I mean, he died of intestinal cancer, and I mean, and you could, from his letters, you can tell he was complaining about things as early as like 3 years before he died, and if he had gone at that time to get it looked at, maybe his life could have been extended. But the knowledge of how to treat cancer at that time was so primitive, I doubt that much could have been done. So, and as I say, he did not, in fact, go to the doctor until right at the end of his life, and it was far too late then.
I saw the telegram that his aunt sent out. Howard dead, nothing. It's so dispassionate. It's like, my nephew's dead, big deal, and it's just like, I have no doubt that she, sincerely mourned his passing. I mean, she, this is his aunt Annie Gamwell. That was what was left of the family. Her nephew and herself. That was it. And now he was gone, and she was basically by herself. She died a couple years later, but that was a bad situation. It would have had to have been very, I would think, oppressive being raised by a crazy mother who on one hand loved him, on the other hand despised him for his maleness. And you think of the old maid Edwardian Victorian era, we're talking about an era in history where young boys were forced to wear something on their privates so that if they had nocturnal emissions, it would shock the hell out of them. I can't imagine.
Well, it's funny because just today, a little earlier today, I was watching, Ken Burns' thing on the Roosevelts, and they said that I think Franklin Roosevelt actually was dressed in what they called a frock, a little long dress, basically, up to the age of 6. Well, Lovecraft was the same. His mother kept him in a frock until he was 4 years old, and he had long golden curls. The story is that she wanted a girl, and he ended up being a boy, and so maybe she tried to pretend he was a girl for a long time, but eventually Lovecraft said, hey, I want these curls cut off, I don't like them anymore, and I want to wear pants instead of this frock. So his mother is certainly a piece of work. I mean, Lovecraft, revered her, of course, and mourned her passing when he was 31, but she did a number on him, and I'm actually amazed how relatively sane Lovecraft turned out to be over the next, the remaining, 10, 15 years of his life after her death. He actually recovered psychologically from some pretty severe traumas that she inflicted on him.
Yeah, I find that his, when you consider his background, it's no wonder he wrote what he did, because he had to get that angst out somehow.
Yeah, I mean, all these stories about, inbreeding and, corruption of the family line. I mean, that's a strong thread in a lot of his stories. Clearly, I mean, he knew a lot about his own family. I mean, he was a devoted genealogist, and he liked to trace his ancestry all the way back to, the 17th century and all that. So he knew that, especially in Rhode Island, it was, kind of cut off from the rest of the nation, and by design. I mean, it broke off from Massachusetts back in the 17th century, and was its own little enclave there. And so there was a lot of marrying of first cousins. A lot of Lovecraft's first cousins got married and things like that. So he knew that there was this. I mean, or maybe he felt that there was some sort of taint in his ancestry, and some of that comes out in his writing.
Yeah, and of course he had his racist side. He would probably be shunned wholesale by today's standards.
Oh, yeah. I mean, and people have raked him over the coals about his racism, but, quite frankly, I mean, we can maybe get into this later, but, I mean, there's so much to say about that. I mean, you really got to look at the period he was living in and the intellectual influences and cultural influences of his time. I mean, he was by no means alone in adopting these attitudes. I mean, in fact, in his day, it's hard to find somebody who didn't have those attitudes rather than somebody who did. They were very common.
Yes, exactly. He was a product of his times, and there wasn't really at that time, I mean, you got that kind of wholesale racism, especially on the East Coast with the...
Absolutely, especially among the so-called old-time, New Englanders, they legitimately felt that, this was their country and their part of the world, and now you have this huge influx of immigrants. I mean, if you look at the statistics there, between 1890 and 1924, when some severe immigration restriction bills were passed in Congress, between those 35 years, something like 15 million immigrants had come into the United States from all over the world, Western Europe, Southern Europe, Asia, Latin America. The whole U.S. population was only about 110 million altogether, so it's, about, practically 1/10, 1/7 of the whole nation was immigrants, recent immigrants, and, a lot of other social change was happening too, technological change, and I think Lovecraft, as others did, found in these immigrants a convenient scapegoat against the rapid change that was happening in their time. They were easy to target as kind of the symbols of all these changes that they didn't like.
I know this is a hypothetical question for you, ST, but I'm just curious. Out of all the writings that H.P. Lovecraft created, and he didn't get to see much because of his short life, but in your estimation, what would he think about if he were to see today's genre of horror, going from Stephen King all the way to the Nightmare on Elm Street, Friday the 13th, surreal types of slasher-type films? Do you think he would enjoy the spin-offs that he created?
I think he would have a dim view of a lot of the horror fiction or film that's out there, because he was into, he was into subtlety and indirection and keeping things off stage as much as possible. when we read Lovecraft, we seem to see a lot of kind of over-the-top, horror and monsters and everything like that. But if you read him carefully, he exercises great restraint in thrusting those horrors at you. They only come after a very careful build-up of atmosphere, and then he kind of lets them out. There are some writers today who are certainly working not specifically in his tradition, but in that kind of manner of keeping things, more restrained, involving more subtlety and indirection. People like Ramsey Campbell, who actually started out as a Lovecraft devotee and wrote his first book of imitations of Lovecraft, but then has gone on, I think, to become one of the great horror writers of today. Doesn't get the press that people like Stephen King does, but to my mind, he is unquestionably the greatest weird fiction writer since Lovecraft. There's people like Thomas Ligotti, who is actually now finally getting some recognition after a good many years of working in obscurity. And there are some other writers like that, but most of the best-selling writers, I think Lovecraft would say, I'm sorry to say it, but they're kind of hacks. A lot of the films are just way over the top. They leave nothing to the imagination. This is not the kind of stuff that he would like.
Oh, every time I see a film, with the exception of Stuart Gordon's rendition of Dreams in the Witch House, though it took place in modern times, I feel like he really caught the spirit of the story. He followed it. Most of the Lovecraft films he's probably spun in his grave over the Reanimator. Many times.
Well, the funny thing about Reanimator is Reanimator, in a sense, is a weirdly faithful, only in the sense that Lovecraft's own story, Herbert West Reanimator, clearly it's itself a parody. You're meant to laugh at some of the crazy stuff that goes on in that story, and in that strange way, the film Reanimator, which is very campy and over the top, is itself a parody of itself and of that kind of extreme horror. But the one film that I think is truly a faithful adaptation is a German production called Die Farbe, The Color. It's an adaptation of The Color Out of Space, just done a couple of years ago. It is magnificent. I mean, if there's one Lovecraft film that I think deserves to be classified as a great adaptation, that's it. And I urge everybody to see that.
I have not heard of that one. I will look that up immediately. There was a modern, they made it in black and white, just like an old silent movie. They did The Call of Cthulhu. And
yes,
it was very good it had very good production values. And they did that kind of silent picture where you had to use facial expression and gesture because there was no dialogue. And I feel like they nailed it.
Indeed. That film was done by two guys who call themselves the H.P. Lovecraft Historical Society. Not sure why exactly. They call themselves that, but no matter. And in fact, you can get that Die Farbe film through them if you go to their website. But anyway, that Call of Cthulhu film is magnificent. Only about 45 minutes, but it really nails it. Then they followed that up with a talkie set in the 1930s, kind of like the old Universal horror films, called The Whisper in Darkness, which I thought was pretty good. I had some problems with the ending there, but nevertheless, that also had a good feel to it. Also black and white, and again, captured kind of the atmosphere of what it might be like to be in a Lovecraft story.
I always found it. I have relatives up in Rhode Island, and whenever HP needed a villain or the twisted assistant that was in the background doing all the dirty work, he chose the surname Gomes. I am related to the Gomes, and I find that really humorous, And I found out real quick that if it's spelled Gomes, it is not Gomez.
There's a character, at least in the case of Charles Dexter Ward, who's of that name. Right.
Yeah, I found out real quick it's Gomes. I was firmly but politely corrected. But if you go into that area, like just go to Swan Point Cemetery, the way the wall around that cemetery where H.P. Lovecraft is buried. It looks like something out of his fiction stacked those stones. As soon as you pull up to that place, you're like, this is where H.P. Lovecraft should be buried. Because it looks just like a stone wall out of his work.
Absolutely. Well, that's a historic cemetery. It dates to like the mid-19th century, but nevertheless, the interesting thing about that cemetery is right next to it is Butler Hospital for the Insane. I think that was at least what it used to be called, which is where both his parents died. I mean, Lovecraft's father in 1898, and then his mother about 20-some years later. So, yeah, and I think Lovecraft barely escaped being in that place himself. But as I say, he managed to recover from this early trauma and live a reasonably normal life.
Do you think the reading and the people that he corresponded with? In one hand, there's this introvert who wouldn't come out of the library, and one period in his life, I believe I read, he was bedbound for, I don't remember how long. It was like an incredible amount of time where he just couldn't drag himself out of bed. Do you think the letters that he wrote to people, this is obviously pre-internet, and a lot of people probably didn't even have phones at this era. Correspondence might have been what kept him.
Was never bedridden in that sense. What happened was after he went through like 3 years of high school, and then in 1908, when he was about 18, he had what he called a nervous breakdown. Not sure exactly what that means, but for the next about 4 or 5 years, he basically kept at home. I mean, he was doing some stuff, but he didn't like to go out, and whenever he did go out, he would always dress in this kind of like a trench coat, with the collar pulled up to his ears and looking straight ahead, not trying to meet anybody's eyes, and dropped a lot of his friends because he felt embarrassed at the fact that he was a high school dropout. I mean, he was a guy who valued learning and education so much. I mean, this is what he wanted to be. He wanted to be an intellectual and a professor, and yet he couldn't even finish high school. So he was humiliated. He really became kind of a recluse just at that time. And then in 1914, he came out of it by joining this movement called amateur journalism. Now, what that is a bunch of people all around the country who published these little magazines that they just, gave away to people. It was all done, without interest in money. Basically, it was a means of practicing the art of printing. Although, of course, you had people who also wanted to, were trying their hand at writing, not so much stories, but essays, poetry, whatever. And this little world was just the right thing to get Lovecraft out of his shell, because it was a small little community where somebody of his, formidable intelligence could shine, without being, threatened by, academics or other people like that who might have intimidated him. And that's what drew him out of his shell. And that's how he started getting in touch with other people, who shared some of his interests, some of whom didn't share his interests. But that little world is finally what got him out into the world again. And Lovecraft, I think, used correspondence as a means of communicating. Because not that he didn't like communicating face-to-face with people, but living in Providence, Rhode Island, I mean, let's be honest, it was not an intellectual haven. I'm sorry to say, it still isn't, aside from Brown University. It's not known for its high level of intellect. So he didn't find a lot of people in his own hometown with whom he could have interesting conversations on whatever subjects interested him. So he had to go outside. He had to get in touch with people all around the country, really, who could kind of talk back at him through letters. And people did exchange letters back and forth. I mean, he may have written, 90, 100,000 letters over the course of 20, 25 years. And it's, he really poured his heart out in those letters, and that's really how he talked to people.
I was always amazed that, you're right. No insult to the people in Providence, but it's a very blue collar, working class town. You get your job, you join a union when you're 18 out of high school, you work your entire career as a carpenter, a painter, you have some kind of a trade, and you don't get you don't get too big for your britches there, because
that's right.
The family will
Boston's
knock
so
you
close
down.
by. I mean, if you want intellectual or artistic stuff, you go to Boston, which is a 40-minute drive up the road there. So that's where you get the orchestras and the libraries and the art galleries and all that sort of thing. And Lovecraft did, of course, go there a lot. But he had such a close tie to Providence. I think we have to emphasize how important Providence was to his whole kind of psychological well-being. I mean, it is a beautiful city. I mean, especially with the old colonial part of town, the so-called College Hill, east side of Providence. That's where he spent most of his life. I mean, you have a continuous history dating back to the early to mid 17th century, and all the relics of history are there. And Lovecraft, grew up with a tremendous sense of the heritage of his area. And always kind of looking back to the past. He could have actually made a great historian, and some of his stories are full of interesting kind of historical sidelights and things like that. But Providence meant a lot to him, and that's why it was really a fundamental mistake for him to pull up roots. And when he got married, he found himself very attracted to this woman named Sonia Green, whom he met through this amateur journalism circuit. She was a high-powered businesswoman in New York City, living in Brooklyn, and they had a kind of a 3-year courtship, and he said, "Hey, let's get married," and they did. But this was when Lovecraft was in his, let's see, how old was he? About 34 years old. But he was, in my judgment, still sort of emotionally unprepared for marriage. I mean, he just really, he was not a ladies' man. He had very little experience with women prior to that. He just didn't know what it took to have a successful marriage. But so he moved to New York, couldn't get a job. She lost her job, and so they both had money troubles. Then she had to move out to the Midwest to work, leaving Lovecraft alone in this huge city that he didn't know very well. I mean, he had a bunch of friends there, to be sure, but he started becoming really, paranoid and depressed, and his little one-room apartment got broken into, and he got robbed of most of his clothing. I mean, my God, there was one disaster after another. So he had a very bad time in New York, and after 2 years, he said, "I'm done with this. I just got to get back to Providence." And he just fled. He just went back to Providence and basically left his wife to shift for herself, and basically the marriage was over. But so that whole 2-year period, horrible as it was, did, I think, help to shape his later life. It did kind of mature him. It showed him another part of the world. It helped him understand people better and things like that. So that's all of a sudden he comes back in 1926, and then that's when he starts writing this great stuff, The Call of Cthulhu and The Case of Charles Exeter Ward, Color Out of Space, and on from there. It's an amazing transformation from the earlier work that he was writing.
Yeah, he didn't have to rely so much on the inbred hillbilly of the Catskills as a dramatic. I forgot which story it is. I know I've read them all, but of course it was I forgot his term for it. But the person that was in the insane asylum was a terribly inbred person from the Catskill Mountains who should have had no idea about astronomy, but this being had taken him over.
That's right. That's Beyond the Wall of Sleep. Yeah, a pretty early story where some being from from outer space basically inhabited the mind of this backwoods guy from the Catskills, and interesting in conception, but very poor story in execution. But Lovecraft, worked with that kind of theme later on, and that's where he develops this whole idea of Cosmicism. He said, the world, the whole world, the whole planet Earth is an insignificant little atom in the midst of this vast, infinite cosmos, both temporally and spatially. I mean, the cosmos is infinite in extent and infinite in time. That's what he believes anyway. And so the whole history of Earth life, including the history of the human race, amounts to nothing in the vast scheme of things. And that's what his later work, emphasizes over and over again in different ways. And that's really, to my mind, his significant contribution to literature. I don't know anybody who has expressed that particular conception as powerfully as he has.
Oh yeah, and that scene in At the Mountains of Madness, and I'm with you. I sure hope that gets made into a good movie. But as has been stated, there's no happy ending. There's no love interest. It's so stark that it would be a very difficult film to make. But there's that point where I don't know how you translate the way he did, where the explorers are looking at these carvings and seeing how they degenerate through the generations, but they're still beyond any earthly artist's skill. And then there's a point where they see this ape-like creature that is basically the proto-human, created by the old ones. And, he says it right there for all to see. We're not a divine creation. We're a lab experiment by these once star-faring, more or less animal-vegetable hybrids.
That's right. I mean, he actually says this ape-like creature was created, A, as a source of food, and B, as a butt of jest. I mean, it's incredibly cynical and misanthropic, actually, and kind of funny in some ways. But I mean it's hard to degrade the human race any farther than he has in that particular story. It's
absolutely
really incredible.
Yeah, I mean there's no ambiguity whatsoever. In that one moment, you see all of his mythanthropism. I think I pronounced that wrong. But you see his opinion, his low regard for his fellow human beings, even in the tone of voice of the way the story is written as a cautionary tale to the next expedition that's going.
Right.
And you get this overwhelming, well, I know you idiots are going to do this anyway, but, this is what you're going to see. And he was one of the first of the writers who would, while describing something, would make it so horrible that it defied words and would let the imagination of the reader fill in the gaps. And I think that's some of the, I'll go ahead and call it genius of his writing.
That's
I'm
right.
not going to spell it out for you. I'm going to let your imagination fill in what a Shoggoth. I'll give you a broad idea of what a Shoggoth is. You run with it as the writer or as the reader.
I mean, he'd give you just enough hints for your own imagination to get to work, and that's an amazing feat. I mean, he doesn't have to spell it out for you. He spells out other things. He actually describes these, the what he calls the old ones, the creatures who created human beings, quite detailedly. In fact, that's what got me as a kid. I mean, when I was reading, at the age of 13, it was all this scientific lingo that it was baffling to me. But he is very precise in describing those creatures, because those creatures, in the end, are not the true horrors of the story. The true horror is that horrible protoplasmic creature called the Shoggoth, which is another one of their creatures, that they created for as a kind of a slave, really slave labor in some sense, that eventually rebelled against them and overthrew them. And that's where he leaves a fair amount to the imagination. I mean, he goes into some detail about the Shoggoth, too, especially when it appears right at the end of that story. In fact, I think that climactic scene when the two human narrators are being chased by this horrible Shoggoth, I think that scene is like one of the most frightening things in the history of literature, in my judgment. It is very hard to top that scene in terms of pure physical and spiritual terror.
We are talking H.P. Lovecraft tonight on Spaced Out Radio. My co-host tonight, who's doing a fantastic job, Eric Markham from the SOR Spacewire. Our guest tonight, St. Joshi. If you want to go to his website, it's stjoshi.org. This man is a legend when it comes to knowledge of H.P. Lovecraft. We only got about 30 seconds left before we go to break, so I want to quickly get in one question here for you, ST, if you don't mind. What do you think is the biggest carryover from back in the day and his writings leading up to today? What is the most popular part of HP?
I think that what really gets people today is that he formed this whole universe of horror. I mean, he didn't write separate stories. Each story builds upon what went before, and that's why they all read as kind of occupying the same universe. And I think that's really what draws people in and what other people have tried to imitate over the years.
Excellent. You're listening to Spaced Out Radio. I am your host, Dave Scott. And we will be right back after this quick break that we are going to take. I'm joined once again by Eric Markham from the SOR Spacewire. He is co-hosting with me. Our guest tonight, talking about all things H.P. Lovecraft, is St. Joshi. And we want to thank everyone listening in, of course, in the chat rooms. The chat rooms are buzzing about this tonight. Just buzzing. We are enjoying every single moment of it. We'll be back right after this break.
Looking for news beyond the mainstream news? Head to spacedoutradio.com and check out the SOR Spacewire. This is Spaced Out Radio's Eric Markham, News Director for the SOR Spacewire. Daily, I will bring you intriguing stories and outlandish reports from what's going on around the world. UFO sightings, paranormal activity, conspiracies, alternative health, and so much more. And if you have news, email me at news@spacedoutradio.com.
Hi there, I'm Butch Witkowski, lead investigator with U4COP. On the final Monday of every month, you can listen to me and host Dave Scott on Spaced Out Radio's Strange Days. We're going to get to the heart of the matter when it comes to what's happening out there. People are seeing and experiencing things from ET contact to Bigfoot, and I want to hear about it. Your experiences are what we investigators need to help solve these unknown mysteries, so tune in at spacedoutradio.com.
Have you had an experience you can't explain? Had a run-in with ghosts, maybe Bigfoot, or seen lights in the sky? Hi, I'm Mike Schmidt from the SOR Sightlines. I'm here to investigate your sighting. Head to spacedoutradio.com and fill out a report on the Sightlines. All your information is 100% confidential, and I will help you figure out what you've been seeing. File your report, and let's find out the answers together.
Visit purpleplates.com today. For over 40 years, the Purple Energy Plates have been delivering amazing results for their many customers. Inspired by the great genius Nikola Tesla, the harmony, healing, and energetic effects of the plates have proven over and over to be beneficial and often miraculous to thousands of customers. With their money-back guarantee and the many benefits, how can you afford not to get one? Check their site for daily specials and choose from their many energy products. You won't be sorry. Visit them today at purpleplates.com for mind, body, and spirit, and expect a miracle.
Strange creatures lurking in the night, the sounds of wood knocking in the forest, odd happenings right out of a fictional world. These are the reports I love. Hi there, this is author Ronald Murphy, and I would love it if you join me and Spaced Out Radio host Dave Scott the second Wednesday of every month on our journey into the unknown land of cryptozoology at spacedoutradio.com. From Mothman to Frogman and everything in between. Hey, they don't call me the crypto guru for nothing.
Are you interested in advertising on Spaced Out Radio? Head to our website at spacedoutradio.com and click on our advertising tab. There, you will find an assortment of ways you can get your product out there with us, from radio commercials to banners and social media. Have a product you like our hosts to endorse? We can do that too. Visit spacedoutradio.com for more details.
From British Columbia to Northern California, Pacific North Weird has Cascadia covered. Check out our feature videos at spacedoutradio.com, where I, Vincent Zunza, and my super sleuth partner Alexandra Sullivan track down the weird and strange stories from around the Pacific Northwest, from Bigfoot to Mel's Hole and everything in between. This is what makes life exciting. So why report the normal when we can report the Pacific North Weird right here at spacedoutradio.com.
Oh, there's only one way to rock. Loud and proud. In high definition. Radio 702 rocks. Las Vegas.
Have you ever had an extraterrestrial experience? One you just couldn't explain? Well, maybe I can help. Hello, I am Samantha Mullet. On the second Tuesday of each month, I will join Dave Scott on Spaced Out Radio to bring a human aspect to ET contact. It's something I've lived with my entire life, and I'd love to help you understand. Let's share our experiences. The ET Experience, the second Tuesday of each month, only on Spaced Out Radio.
Hi there, this is Jolene with Revealette Reiki and Readings, and I want you to relax. Let me help you chill out and get in touch with your body, mind, and soul. In this busy world, sometimes we need to let go, and this is where I can help. Visit my website, revealetteRndr.wix.com/Revealette
Every Saturday and Sunday night, as Dave Scott wanders aimlessly in the wilderness. You can come hang out with me, James Tyson, in Spaced Out Weekend. Starting at 9 p.m. Pacific, midnight Eastern, I'll take you along as we talk with some of the best experts in their fields. SpacedOutRadio.com is the place to find us. So sit down, relax, put your feet up. Enjoy the topics like the paranormal, supernatural, intuitiveness, and so much more. Hope to see you there.
Hi there, this is your psychic medium Joanna, and I would love it if you would join us every other Sunday on Spaced Out Weekend. With host James Tyson, we'll bring you personal psychic messages on two mediums and a large. Questions about love, life, career changes. We would love it if you would come and join us live. Call in and listen in for the experience. Allow us to open the doors to your other side. Two mediums and a large, heard only on Spaced Out Weekend at spacedoutradio.com.
Would you like to become one of our space travelers? All you have to do is click on the Space Travelers icon at spacedoutradio.com. For only $5 a month, you can get access to some great prizes, as well as private monthly shows, newsletters, and a members-only section on our website. Become a space traveler today.
Do you have a topic or a guest that you'd like to hear on Spaced Out Radio? Let us know at spacedoutradio.com, where you can sign up to become a Space Traveler member today. Or you can find us on Twitter at Spaced Out Radio and on our Facebook page, Spaced Out Radio Show. Welcome back to Spaced Out Radio. Tonight I am your host, Dave Scott. Good to have you along for the ride. Tomorrow night on the show, John Potash will join us. We're going to talk about the CIA's involvement in the drug trade and a lot more black ops. It's tomorrow night on Spaced Out Radio, starting at 9 p.m. Pacific, midnight Eastern Time at spacedoutradio.com. Hey, we want to welcome in everyone listening in on the United Public Radio Network live on 107.7 FM in New Orleans and 160 countries around the world. Good to have you with us on a nightly basis. And if you're listening in on Revolution Radio, remember the Double R Machine is a donation station financed by you, the valued listener. Do us a favor, visit freedomslips.com and donate today. Bill Cardwell has set the password in the SOR Space Travelers Club for tonight. Immunoelectrophoresis. Immunoelectrophoresis. I think I probably butchered that, but either way, it's a good effort. You know what to do with the password, Space Travelers, so make sure you use it wisely. If you want to follow us on social media, you can do so on Twitter at Spaced Out Radio. Give our Facebook page a like. Spaced Out Radio Show. On Instagram, I can be followed at Dave Scott SOR. Subscribe to our YouTube channel, Spaced Out Radio Show. Tune us in on TuneIn. Download this show and others on iTunes. And our website is spacedoutradio.com. While there, we have a plethora of options for you to choose from. I hope you go and peruse, including joining the SOR Space Travelers Club. It breaks down to $5 a month. Come on, do it. We want to give you some free swag on a monthly basis. Tonight we are talking about the legendary author H.P. Lovecraft. Hard to believe he didn't even publish a single book. One of the experts on this topic is right here on this show, St. Joshi. His website is stjoshi.org, and we're also joined by Eric Markham from the SOR Spacewire, who is co-hosting with me. Gentlemen, welcome back.
Hi.
Glad to be here.
There's so much history, St., in regards to H.P. Lovecraft, his story, what is truth, what is myth. There are so many different legends about this man. Could you maybe go over some of the things that were really accentuated in the myth category? Because when I was doing my research on this show, I couldn't believe that everybody was going off about, some of the fallacies in his writing to saying he was a closet homosexual.
Yeah, I mean, it's so hard to sort the truth from the myth. In a sense, the myth-making began even in a sense in Lovecraft's own lifetime, because through all these letters that I've mentioned, he wrote to all these different people. He himself created a kind of persona of what he wanted to be. He wanted to create the impression that he was this kind of kind of mysterious, obscure writer of horror stories, working in his lonely apartment in Providence, Rhode Island, writing at night and sleeping during the day. You can tell that he was kind of, pushing that persona himself. And then after his death, so many other things kind of took off. This thing about being a homosexual. Well, okay, let's be honest. Lovecraft's relationships with women were, shall we say, troubled. First his relationship with his mother. That was the whole thing we've already talked about. He was very devoted to his aunts, but aside from the woman he married, Sonia Green, he really had very few romantic involvements with women. There's one other person we know of before that who may or may not have kind of gone out with Lovecraft every now and then. He wrote quaint little poems to certain women, early in his life, but Poe did the same thing too, I guess. But so he didn't have much experience with women. So then Sonia comes along, and basically she goes after him. It's quite clear from reading her memoir of him and other things that he writes that she was attracted to him and said, okay, I want this guy to be, whether to be a husband or not, but whatever, I'm impressed with this guy's intellect, and maybe I can make something of him, make him a successful writer, a successful human being. Well, it didn't quite work out that way, but, I think Lovecraft was basically flattered by her interest in him, and in fact, one of his friends said he accepted, her proposal of marriage because it was ungentlemanly not to do so. Not sure that's the best reason to get married, but no matter, that seems to be what happened.
Yeah, that kind of ties in with his Anglophile. What would a fine, upstanding English gentleman do? Because he was quite, he was known as quite the Anglophile.
Oh yes, he created this another persona that he deliberately created was of being an old man, even when he was in his 20s. He liked to call himself Grandpa Tybalt. That's one of his pseudonyms. Looks like Theobald, but it's pronounced Tybalt. So he liked to create the impression that he was an old man, with this sort of band of young, enthusiastic followers, at his feet. But this whole marriage is really puzzling from a lot of reasons. Some people say, oh, well, here's Sonia Green. She was a Jewish immigrant born in the Ukraine, had lived in England and then lived in America for many years, but had been married at least once before, maybe twice before, I can't remember, but and had a grown child, a daughter in her 20s when she first met Lovecraft. How did Lovecraft, who, let's be honest, was more or less of an anti-Semite, why did he get attracted to this Jewish woman? Well, I'll tell you why. That is not so hard to explain, because what Lovecraft was interested in was cultural assimilation. That is to say, you could be an immigrant, but if you adopted Western ways of thinking, or American ways, that was all right. And that's what he felt Sonia had done. She had shed her Jewish heritage in his mind and become what Friedrich Nietzsche would call a good European. So she had culturally assimilated to Western and American values, and so that her ethnicity posed no barrier to him. And he regarded a lot of people like that. He had a number of Jewish friends, people like Samuel Loveman, a fine poet in New York, who also had basically, I wouldn't say renounced his Jewishness, but basically didn't make a big thing of it. Was just a man of letters in New York. So they got married. Now he was 34, she was 41. Which is okay. I'm sure they didn't envision having children or anything like that. But, the marriage might have been a success if she hadn't uprooted Lovecraft from his hometown in Providence and dragged him to New York, where he was obviously unsuited to be. I mean, he had never lived in a huge metropolis like that, and it freaked him out, let's be honest. It totally freaked him out to be in this immense city with all these heterogeneous people. I mean, let's be honest, full of immigrants, people who didn't look like him, so he got, didn't know what to do. He was actually the outsider in many ways in New York City. He was the one who had come from somewhere else and was trying to fit in, and he simply couldn't. And, they had a lot of financial difficulties, and eventually their differences in temperament really started to come to the fore, and so the dissolution of the marriage was pretty much inevitable.
Yeah, but by the time he goes back to Providence and she goes out to the Midwest, it's, for all intents and purposes, it's over. I mean, they did have some correspondence, I think I read, but at that point, there was no way it was ever going to be salvaged. I think of, here's H.P. Lovecraft, raised by what we could arguably say an insane mother, and these two old maid aunts. I'm sure he couldn't have had a healthy idea of sexuality. Plus, as a xenophobe, he moves to New York City. Worst place on earth for somebody who is afraid of everything that is non-white Anglo-Saxon. I mean, I cannot imagine the horror that he must have felt internally being dropped in that environment.
Yeah,
the fact that he hung out as long as he did is a miracle.
Well, yeah, you wanted to talk about the sex. I mean, let's be honest. I mean, sex is always of interest, isn't it? Sonia has written some very interesting, wrote an interesting memoir, about 10 years after Lovecraft's death, about her marriage, and it's a very poignant document. Really, it's sad and funny at the same time, and it's just kind of tragic. But no, she does declare flatly that Lovecraft was a virgin when he was married, and there's no question of that. I mean, nobody doubts that, because he really had very few involvements with women beforehand. But she does say they consummated the marriage. There's no question about that. But she did say that she had to initiate sexual activity every single time. Every single time it had to come from her. He went along, but he never, got the show going, as it were. And quite frankly, they cohabited for only about the first 10 months of 1924, or the last 10 months of 1924, from March to December of 1924. Because then, right at the end of that year, she had to go to the Midwest for work. She worked first in Cincinnati and then in Cleveland, and only came back to New York every couple of weeks, for a few days sometimes, maybe a week or two at a time. And of course they cohabited then, but basically they were living separate lives already after only 10 months of marriage. And so, Lovecraft really never got into the rhythm of marriage, as it were, and basically he was left on his own for, the remaining year and a half that he lived in New York. And he really, at that point, relied on his friends. He had a bunch of friends, very, very close friends, and he met them a lot. I mean, there, Lovecraft became quite gregarious. He actually was going out pretty much every day, meeting his friends in coffee shops and things like this, not getting a whole lot of work done, actually. But those friends were a savior to him, because he he would have gone nuts if he had been just stuck there by himself. But even so, he still came pretty much close to a breakdown until he finally said, I got to get out of here. I got to get back to Providence. It's the only place I feel at home in and comfortable in. So he just left in April of 1926 and basically said, Sonia, that's it. There's one interesting follow-up to this. She wasn't quite ready to give up on the marriage. What she did at some point, it's not clear when this happened, but maybe, let's say, a few months or a year or so later, she came to Providence, met with his two aunts, and said, hey, I am prepared to come here to Providence, open up a hat shop, and I'll support all you people. I'll support my husband. I'll support you two ladies, with the income from this shop that I set up. And they said, and this is something like a direct quote, they said, we cannot afford to have a shopkeeper wife for our nephew. They were so, and I don't criticize them for this attitude, because they had been bred with the idea that they were part of the Providence informal aristocracy. Even though they were already in dire poverty, they still had that attitude bred in them from birth. You can't blame them for that attitude. They could not envision the idea of their nephew having a wife who was a tradeswoman. It would be too demeaning to their, status in the city. If it had been elsewhere, if it had been in Boston or New York or someplace else, that would okay because it's out of sight. They could still preserve their idea of being part of the aristocracy. But right in Providence, no, it would have been too embarrassing. And she said, okay, that's it. Now the marriage is over.
And when you consider at that time, I heard their straits as being called a descending arc of genteel poverty. They tried to keep that appearance up, despite the fact that they were, dirt poor by the end. Yeah, I should emphasize that they were not actually maiden aunts. They actually had both married, but one of them divorced. The other, her husband died, so they were either widowed or divorced. But they were basically living alone and not working. I mean, a woman in her 50s and 60s, especially a widow, she didn't work for a living. She just lived off of her husband's inheritance. That was it. So there was no money coming in. They had a tiny little mortgage, believe it or not. They owned some property out in western Rhode Island, a little like a limestone quarry or something. And some immigrant, oddly enough, an Italian immigrant, rented out or leased that property, and worked the quarry and paid Lovecraft the grand total of $37.08 every 6 months as part of the mortgage. Well, that didn't go very far, even in the 1920s or 30s, but that was it. They had to rely on the inheritance from the grandfather, Whipple Phillips. And Lovecraft made whatever little money he could from writing and revision. But by the end, I'll tell you, they were really running out of money. I mean, they were, Lovecraft in 1936 says, I have never been as close to the breadline as I am this year. And to think that how many languages has his work been translated into? And there's really, you know this more than I do, there is no H.P. Lovecraft family, or there's no... No, because he obviously you have a family. Didn't have any offspring. His aunts, okay, well, let me see, one aunt did have some offspring. I mean, what was left was basically like a second cousin of Lovecraft. The Lovecraft name, so far as I understand, doesn't survive in the U.S. anymore either. So yeah, some very remote relations might be left, but nothing, nothing directly from the Lovecraft line. Yeah, it seems like you've got Winfield Scott Lovecraft, Sarah Phillips to Howard Phillips Lovecraft, and after Howard Phillips Lovecraft, there's no more Lovecrafts. No. The father, that father Winfield, he had some brothers, but and there's been a lot of people. There's one guy in the Chicago area, Kenneth W. Fagg Jr., has done a lot of genealogical research on Lovecraft and his various ancestors and successors or descendants. But yeah, the actual Lovecraft name is pretty much gone from the United States. Wow. That's too bad. So there's no estate. So who gets the? I mean, I paid $20 for the complete works of H.P. Lovecraft. Is it just more or less public domain, or
well, that's a very complicated issue. There actually is a Lovecraft estate in Rhode Island. It's run by a lawyer. I think he's retired now. Who actually worked at the Rhode Island Supreme Court, but he is the grandson of Lovecraft's second cousin, which sounds quite remote, and I guess it is, but, it is a legitimate, descent. That is how Lovecraft's estate descended. Because he predeceased his aunt, Annie Gamwell, she inherited his estate, which includes his literary properties. When she died, her daughter inherited her estate, and then Lovecraft, and it goes on down from there. But so yeah, I mean, I do recognize the Lovecraft estate in Rhode Island as the legitimate owners of whatever rights there are left to Lovecraft's works. Now there might be much, but because much of Lovecraft is in the public domain, I'm not going to say everything is, because the legalities are very complicated. But yeah, so but it is such a shame that Lovecraft himself never profited from this incredible outburst of interest in his work worldwide, as you say. I mean, I've counted at least 30 languages in which Lovecraft's work has appeared now, including Chinese and Russian and Serbo-Croatian and Turkish, and I mean, you name it. I mean, Catalan. I mean, it just goes on and on. It's amazing how many different editions there are of Lovecraft.
That's just amazing, especially considering what a xenophobe he was, and all these people that he would have considered those nasty foreigners are
they're
swallowing up his work.
I know. I got in touch with some Hungarian guy. Says, yeah, I'm forming like a little H.P. Lovecraft club, as it were, in Hungary to promote Lovecraft, and can I use some of your work and things like that. So
it's amazing.
I hear from these people all the time, all around the world. It's just amazing.
Well, he uses so many archetypes, but in a different way. That I think that's part of what the draw to his work is. You can see, even though he's trying to make it as alien as he can, you still see these almost Jungian archetypes that come out in his work.
Oh, absolutely. It's a curious, Lovecraft's work is both timeless in some ways, but also very rooted in the period in which he was writing. But not obviously so. I mean, you don't have to be a scholar of the 1920s or 30s to really understand Lovecraft, because, as I say, these archetypes are always there. And so, precisely because he was a bit more detached from what was going on, all around him, culturally speaking, his work translates both to us, 3 or 4 or 5 generations later, and to people overseas who, again, may not understand what was going on in America in the 1920s and 30s. Whereas other writers of Lovecraft's time, people like Jack London maybe, or Theodore Dreiser, you really have to understand American culture to really get their work, whereas you really don't in Lovecraft's case.
Yeah, because he's just more or less what's going on is just sort of in his background is a passing, just a passing glance at.
That's right. I mean, he takes the universe as his backdrop, not just the world or just this nation or whatever.
Exactly.
I'm going to hop in here for a second, SD, because one of the things I learned about HP, and it kind of ties into what we do on this show with all the strange topics we talk about on a nightly basis here on Spaced Out Radio, he had quite an interest, and I would call it more than an interest, in astronomy and the stars.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, he was quite well versed. I mean, he was almost an academic as far as interest in astronomy was concerned. He started studying it when he was like 12 years old, and he said, "Wow, when he first understood the whole, huge cosmos that opened up when he started studying astronomy, I think he felt that was one of the major things that turned his attention to this whole notion of cosmicism and human insignificance."
Do you think that he was like any type of amateur astronomer or astronomers from the 14th, 15th, 16th centuries when he stared up at the stars? He maybe saw stories involved, or maybe he wondered what was out there. Was there extraterrestrial life? So on and so forth, like many people have imagined when they have such a brain like his that is always constantly on the move.
Oh, without question. I mean, and throughout his life, he kept studying many fields, but particularly astronomy, chemistry, physics. He kept up on all these scientific developments, and there were a lot of radical ones in his time, as you know. I mean, Einstein's theory of relativity, which was basically, it started, Einstein proposed that theory in 1905, but it wasn't really confirmed until certain astronomical observations around the 1920s. I think 1923 is when people could say, yeah, Einstein, this is right. You are right here. And this was written up in a big article in the New York Times, and Lovecraft read it and said, oh, my God. I mean, he was actually quite shaken by the whole theory of relativity, because he felt that it kind of undermined a lot of what he had learned about it, science, from the 19th century. But eventually he took that in stride. He picked up on the quantum theory by Max Planck, the Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. I mean, all this stuff was going on in his time, and he took it all in and makes allusions to it in his stories. And he does speculate on the idea of extraterrestrial life. He felt that there probably is life out there, but we would never come into contact with it because it's so far out there, certainly technologically in his day and certainly even in ours. There's just no way to bridge these immense gulfs of space to reach some other realm where living creatures might exist.
And he had such an interest in both eclipses and comets. I remember reading a line in researching that he absolutely adored the fact that he was able to see Halley's Comet.
That's right. In 1910, where again, that was that period where he had dropped out of high school and was doing virtually nothing, and yet he stayed up all night, went to the Providence, the Brown University Observatory, which is called LAD Observatory. I've been there myself. It's a great tiny little observatory. Dates way back, and he went there and was allowed in because everybody knew about his interest in astronomy. In fact, he had published astronomy articles in local newspapers even when he was a teenager. He saw Halley's Comet, and it was regretted the fact that he probably wouldn't live to see the next one. But there it is.
Do you know what was his fascination with the moon?
Oh, well, his fascination was with the other side of the moon that we never see. I mean, because again, Lovecraft is a strange mixture, because he loved fact. He always wanted to know what was true, what was real, but that wasn't enough for him. He said somewhere, reality is good as far as it goes, but it doesn't go far enough. So he always wanted to know more, and if he didn't know it, he wanted to be able to speculate. In fact, he said he's actually wrote stories as a child, maybe as a teenager, about, set on the other side of the moon, that the dark side that we never see. So again, it was this play of imagination. He loved to exercise his imagination, but that imagination had to start from something real, from the true facts of science, because otherwise, it wasn't satisfying to him.
One final question I have for you on this topic. Was he a believer in extraterrestrial life, or maybe an experiencer? Because I wasn't able to find anything on that.
Generally, he was an extreme skeptic. I mean, he got, some of his colleagues were inclined to believe in either spiritualism or advent of extraterrestrial life. He was a considerable skeptic on this issue. He felt that a lot of this stuff was bogus and just a result of misreporting or misinterpretation of things. I mean, he read the books of Charles Fort, who was one of the big people on this kind of thing, trying to raise some skepticism about the findings of science. And though he enjoyed the books of Charles Fort, he didn't believe Charles Fort. He felt that Fort had just thrown this material together without a whole lot of care about what he was really talking about. I think he felt that there was life out there, but we probably would never come into contact with it.
Oh, especially after once he understood relativity and understood that the faster you can't, even at the speed of light, you're talking these incredible distances that literally take light years to accomplish. But the one science fiction story he wrote, no surprise, the aliens were, of course, the heavies. They watched him die in this weird maze, and just dispassionately. I can't remember the story.
Oh, In the Walls of Eryx, which is set on Venus.
Okay,
yeah.
Yes.
Now, that was a collaborative story. The core idea was created by this young, basically a teenager named Kenneth Sterling, who was living in Providence at the time, was a big science fiction fan, got acquainted with Lovecraft and came up with this idea, actually wrote a draft of this story that Lovecraft liked, but it said, I think we can improve on this idea a bit. So it basically totally rewrote the story. So, to the extent that the idea is Kenneth Sterling's, we really can't say that this reflects Lovecraft's own views. And of course, at that time, not a whole lot was known about the planet Venus, even though it's so relatively close to us. But they didn't know anything really about the surface conditions of Venus. I mean, Lovecraft has these characters walking around, sometimes in spacesuits, sometimes not, taking your helmet off and just wandering around. Obviously, that's impossible, but they didn't know enough. I mean, it was only later in the 50s when we understood that the surface of Venus is not amenable to that kind of treatment.
Right. I think the longest any probe has survived, I think the Russians sent something that lasted an hour and a half, maybe, before it was crushed and melted.
Right. Well, The Color Out of Space really is a science fiction story. I mean, it was published in the first science fiction pulp magazine, Amazing Stories, only about a year after it was founded. It really is a masterpiece. And it's a masterpiece because you can't really even define the entity or entities in that story. That's the greatness of that story, the artistic restraint in, what are these creatures that have come from this meteorite? We know them only from their effects. They kind of corrupt everything. Everything becomes gray and brittle, kind of like, what one critic said is kind of like the effects of atomic radiation, but I'm not sure Lovecraft would have known about that at that time. But and the other thing is, you don't know what these creatures want. I mean, they're so totally non-human that you don't even understand their psychological makeup, or and you can't call them evil just because they have these bad effects upon human beings. That's just an accident of physics. It's frightening precisely because Lovecraft held off and didn't write a simple kind of good versus evil story about horrible aliens doing bad things to us. The restraint in that story is really an amazing feature.
Yeah, and here again, he gives you enough rope to hang yourself with that story. He gives you enough details to get your own mind involved. And I imagine you could have 10 different people read Colors Out of Space and get a slightly different take.
Sure.
But he was
one, and very poignant. I mean, the human characters in that story. Lovecraft is criticized oftentimes for not being able to draw character, but these characters, as they encounter this whatever it is, these entities that cause them to crumble into this gray dust. It's really poignant. You really feel the loss of their their lives. They go mad. They you have to lock the wife gets locked up in the attic. As they used to do. This is the old mad woman in the attic idea. I mean, that really happened in New England, where if a woman goes mad, you put her up in the attic and just leave her there. That's what happens to this poor woman, and basically she crumbles to death, and then the farmer crumbles to death. It's just. It's very touching, actually, and frightening at the same time.
And the wealth of details for somebody who didn't travel that much out of his immediate area. I mean, he wasn't known as a world's greatest explorer by any stretch of the imagination, but the details that he manages to embellish his stories with.
Well, actually, a lot of his stories are based upon fairly first-hand observation, especially in the later 1920s and into the 30s. Travel actually was one of his few, leisure time activities. I mean, he saved up money every year to do a fair amount of traveling up and down the East Coast, usually trying to go to, places where antiquities could be found. He looked up at these, old places, whether it be, Quebec up in Canada or all around New England or Philadelphia, Boston, Washington, D.C., Charleston, South Carolina. He loved Charleston because of its old architecture. It was very much like a kind of a southern Providence in many ways. All the way down, he actually went to Key West at one point and spent some time in Florida. And so a lot of that, the impressions from these travels do work their way into his stories. And indeed, The Color Out of Space is set in central Massachusetts. And Lovecraft visited that area a bunch of times. He had a good friend out there. And that scene in the story is kind of an amalgam of a bunch of places that he visited in that general vicinity, as is the Dunwich Horror, which is also very deeply set in central Massachusetts and drawn from some impressions that he had taken from a trip in the summer of 1928.
Okay, well, that explains a lot then, because I am learning so much.
No, I mean, travel really was. I mean, I published Lovecraft's collected essays in 5 volumes, and there's one whole volume just of his travel writings. He loved to write about all the travels he went to, after a summer, and he wrote several really interesting essays about all the places he had been to, for that season, and a lot of them written this old-fashioned 18th century prose that's just a delight to read. I mean, some people might find it a little heavy-going, but I think it's just delightful. I mean, you can tell that his spirit, his mind and imagination needed the rejuvenation that you get from going to these places, and then he would come back to Providence, kind of re-energized, and then he would start writing these stories.
Just the story he wrote where I see this, the two guys that go out into the swamp to a old cemetery, and the one tells the guy, "Now you stay up here because, old man, your heart's just not sturdy enough to take this." And you listen to this new invention. They had this portable cable phone that they took with them. That whole atmosphere. When I read that book, I can see this guy shivering in this moldy Everglades-like cemetery, listening to his friend talk about the fungus growths on the wall, and the final words in that story, "You fool, he's dead." It's like,
that's the statement of Randolph Carter. Quite an early story. The great thing about that story is he dreamed it. He dreamed that whole story, in late 1919, I think it was. And he wrote a letter to somebody almost immediately after writing, having that dream, and he wrote the whole story down, basically, or the account of the dream, and then just changed a couple of words in the end to make the finished story. Dreams were a big thing to Lovecraft. I mean, a lot of his stories either are based on dreams or have sort of dream imagery in them. I mean, he was a dreamer from way back. I mean, he says one of the first time he really had horrible nightmares is his maternal grandmother had died when he was about 5.5 years old, and the whole house went into mourning, as they did back in the late 19th century. Everybody started wearing black, and didn't go out much, and the whole atmosphere of the house was really frightening to this this young boy. And he said, "My God!" And so he had these horrible dreams about these creatures that he called night gaunts. These faceless, rubbery, winged creatures that would pluck him by his stomach and take him off on these horrible voyages, through the night, and he would wake up screaming and things like this. And eventually he would work that image into his story much later on. But he had all these incredible nightmares throughout the course of his life, and a lot of them get worked into his stories.
ST, was he a big believer in the paranormal?
No. I mean, as I say, he as an atheist and as a philosophical materialist, he said the evidence for this sort of thing is pretty scant, and usually can be, if you examine each individual case, you will find various problems with the evidence, and usually doesn't add up. So I don't believe that he swallowed any of his stuff for real, but he was perfectly willing to use some of these elements in fiction. I mean, he felt that was perfectly okay. In fact, one of the ideas that he really likes to use over and over again is hereditary memory. The idea that you could remember stuff from your own ancestry, going all the way back, and that works its way into a number of interesting stories, and he does it quite delightfully. But he didn't believe in that, of course.
So mainly he used the genre then to basically build his imagination for his own writings.
That's right. I mean, he felt it was perfectly legitimate to use these, paranormal ideas in fiction, as long as you didn't take them seriously as fact.
Eric?
And like The Alchemist, where the guy has ancestors living in the house that the original guy is still in there, and he had the story of the young boy who kept going back to this weird stone temple on his family's property, and would come back with these amazing recollections of things that he had no business knowing about. And it was an ancestor that was slowly but surely taking away his identity and replacing it.
He liked the idea of psychic possession, or the switching of minds. That works its way a number of interesting stories. In particular, I mean, think about this. The Thing on the Doorstep, a fairly late story, is about a man and his wife, and the wife is basically a kind of a sorceress and switches minds with him. She enters his mind, and thrusts his mind into her body. So it's like a real weird gender swapping thing. Of course, Lovecraft doesn't make much of that, the gender idea, unfortunately. I think somebody today could do some very interesting things with that idea. But the idea of you being thrust out of your own body into the body of somebody else and seeing, things through somebody else's eyes. Yeah, Lovecraft was fascinated with that idea. And then in The Shadow Out of Time, one of his late stories, he has these extraterrestrial entities cast their minds forward in time and do the same sort of mind swapping there, so that some alien creature inhabits the body of a human being, let's say in the early part of the 20th century, and basically for the purpose of learning about that civilization. So he spends a couple of years in the body of this human being, even though he's an alien, and learns everything there is to know, and writes down everything, and then goes back into his own extraterrestrial body. It's a fascinating conception, but Lovecraft didn't believe in it, but it led to some of his more interesting stories.
Well, a lot of modern authors do hold a great debt to the creative imagination of H.P. Lovecraft. I mean, Neil Gaiman has taken night gaunts and run with them. And a lot of his fiction, the Graveyard Book, which is sort of a weird take on the Jungle Book. Night gaunts, vampires, werewolves, and some of the other, like ghouls, because I know H.P. Lovecraft had stories about the ghouls under the cemetery that were, going from grave to grave, and this one guy found them, and then he ends up trapped, caught. It was something about the rats. The guy was actually after rats, but
yes, Pickman's model, where this artist in Boston actually, starts painting pictures of these ghouls. They've been coming up from the cellars, or from underground in Boston, and in Lovecraft's conception, ghouls are cannibals. I mean, they eat the dead, and that's how they survive, and they're kind of rubbery dog-like creatures, and inhabit basically the underworld. And then the next story he wrote, The Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath, which is actually set in the dream world, but there are ghouls there too, kind of go back and forth between the dream world and the real world. And Pickman has now become a ghoul and is living, in the realm of dream. Lovecraft was fascinated with that idea and could have done even more with it, but some modern writers have run with that idea as well. One of the leading writers of Lovecraftian fiction today, I have to mention her, is Caitlin Kiernan. I mean, she lives in Providence, right in Lovecraft's hometown. She has done some amazing work, both in short stories and novels, that used Lovecraft as a springboard for some fascinating ideas of her own. But her vision is deeply infused with Lovecraft while remaining fundamentally original to herself. So I would certainly advise people to read her work.
Oh yeah, she's top flight. I was introduced to her work through the work of an author I know in Virginia named David Niall Wilson, and they actually did David would try to stay away from Lovecraft in his writing. But some of the best writing David does is when he goes into that Lovecraft-esque world. And they finally got a bunch of him and some other authors, including, I believe, Kieran, went into let's make a volume where we all take the Lovecraftian idea and run with it. And it yielded some of the best work that I've ever heard, I've ever seen him write. And you get this whole dynamic when you get into H.P. Lovecraft's framework. You've got this dynamic that almost drags you into that world, whether you want to be drug in or not.
Yeah, well, it's amazing. It's difficult to find any contemporary writer of weird fiction who hasn't been influenced by Lovecraft one way or the other. Stephen King readily acknowledges that he's, read Lovecraft very early on when he was a teenager and was fascinated by him, and he's written some, overt pastiches of Lovecraft, a story called Jerusalem's Lot back in the 70s, and other things since then. Peter Straub, fine novelist, has wrote a whole novel called Mr. X that's basically a Lovecraft story. In fact, actually in some ways has Lovecraft as a character in that story. Even Anne Rice, you would not think that her writing is at all Lovecraftian, and generally speaking it isn't, but she wrote a novel called The Tale of the Body Thief, which is, again, on this idea of swapping of minds, just like in Lovecraft's The Thing on the Doorstep, which, in fact, I think she mentions in the novel itself, so that was clearly an influence there. Clive Barker, I haven't sensed a whole lot of Lovecraft influence. I don't think he likes Lovecraft that much, but in some ways, there's some threads of Lovecraft in his work as well. But I think, as I say, Ramsey Campbell, without question, has written many works that are deeply imbued with Lovecraft's vision. And it just goes on. Neil Gaiman has written several stories in the Lovecraft idiom. Just goes on and on.
Well, and you reminded me, one of the other fairly accurate treatments of a Lovecraft short story was the original, I think it was in the first season of Rod Serling's Night Gallery. They did a Pickman's model that follows the story quite well. And you just got, it's like, oh my, this woman is fascinated by his work, but it's like, this is so ghastly. What are you using for a model? And, they hint at it, but it's not till the very end of the story that you realize that he's drawing these things from life.
Yeah.
And that's that moment of horror.
On successive weeks, Night Gallery did 2 Lovecraft adaptations. They'd first, actually, I don't know which one is first, but they did Cool Air, which I thought was a pretty good adaptation. Lovecraft story is set in New York City. I'm not sure that the Night Gallery thing was set there, but nevertheless, that was a pretty good adaptation too. And then the very next week, they did Pickman's model. Rod Serling actually was something of a Lovecraft buff. I wish he would have done more adaptations, but at least he did those 2.
Well, in that whole show, Rod Serling was promised one thing. He thought he was going to have the same kind of creative control that he had with his, Twilight Zone.
Mm.
But basically, he didn't read the fine print, and all they really wanted, all the producers of that show really wanted, was Rod Serling's name. I think if he'd have had more creative license and been more able to be at the helm of that show, you would have seen more Lovecraft.
Yeah, no doubt. No doubt.
And he was a good one to do it, because both of his follow the story quite well. I forgot about I had seen Cool Air. I found it on YouTube or something. I think it's since been, you can't find a lot of those things on YouTube because somebody still has the license to Night Gallery. It's real hard to find the complete Pickman's model on YouTube.
Well, of course, the entire 3-season run of Night Gallery is available on DVD now. Took a while to come out, but you can get all 3 seasons now on DVD. But and I think Night Gallery, the 2 Lovecraft ones are in the 2nd season. I could be wrong about that, but they're there. But of course, they introduce women. Lovecraft is notorious about not having women characters in his stories, which it was not nearly as uncommon back then as it is now. I mean, you have Sherlock Holmes, and Watson going around. This paired male character thing was very common in those days, and it was not at all unusual not to have any significant women characters, and there are very few in Lovecraft. I mean, the one I mentioned, The Thing on the Doorstep, with the wife swapping minds with her husband, is about the only one that you can think of. Maybe the Dunwich Horror has poor Lavinia Whately, who gives birth, to these horrible twins, who become the Dunwich Horror, but she's actually a fairly minor character. He gets killed off pretty early. Pretty hard to find women characters in Lovecraft otherwise, but
right. Well, even with Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, he married Watson off, and then proceeded to write the stories as if it was just him and Holmes batching it. And then every once in a while, it's like, oh, crap, that's right. I have him married. I better throw his wife in there once in a while for the continuity of it. I find with there was one about as risque as I think Lovecraft ever went. It was one of the stories that takes place, I believe it's in Gloucester, Massachusetts. It's one of the coastal fishing towns, and it involves a dolphin, and he puts it, the dolphin's been at her. He leaves it there. But the female characters, when he did have them, there was always something wrong with them. Like this woman was a native of this town, had more or less a fish-like appearance. He was always big on the fish-like appearance of.
I think you're referring to The Shadow over Innsmouth, which really that's a great, great story. Lovecraft claimed that was based actually on Newburyport, Massachusetts. Now, I don't know if you've been to Newburyport lately, but it's totally changed around. I mean, in Lovecraft's day, it was actually kind of a decaying backwater. I mean, really, it was kind of run down. Now it's a total yuppie resort town. Nothing like what Lovecraft saw back in the 1920s, but yeah, he went to Newburyport a bunch of times, and that got his imagination going as to what might be coming out from the sea, and landing on on soil, and these kind of run down old fishermen. What are they going to do? I think that's one of his great stories, and Stuart Gordon did an adaptation of that as a film. He called it Dagon, even though it really is The Shadow over Innsmouth. And that was a pretty good adaptation. Again, I had some problems with some of the endings, but he kind of captured the sense of this decaying, seaport town and what things might be coming from the sea.
And the bedridden young lady that eventually, when the covers get ripped off, her legs are tentacles. And I remember that. I think his Dreams in the Witch House was a much better, more... But there again, he threw in... Stuart Gordon, for a modern audience, had to throw in a sexual content with the witch that wasn't there in the Stuart.
Yeah,
Gordon.
you're right. Actually, yeah, in the dreams, in Lovecraft's dreams of the witch house, there, the witch Keziah Mason is a female, obviously, but she's a very old and typical old crone, of the of the Salem witchcraft era. So not a whole lot of sexual attraction there, but the funny thing is that. Yeah, the funny thing is that there is sort of a sexual undercurrent in some of Lovecraft's stories. I mean, Thing on the Door, or Shadow of Elizabeth. Obviously, the idea that these fish creatures have mated with human women and have resulted in these horrible hybrid creatures, half human, half fish, that eventually become pretty much all fish and then go down to this, this underwater city of the what they call the deep ones. I mean, there's clearly a sexual element there. There's a sexual element in that gender swapping story I mentioned. The Dunwich Horror, with the idea of this god mating with this poor human woman and begetting these horrible monsters. So it's there, but it's sort of hidden away. But I think Lovecraft means it to be there, but he just doesn't push it in your face the way we would today.
Probably from lack of practical experience.
Perhaps.
We only got about a minute left here until we go to break, so I'm going to just hold on 1 second with you, gentlemen, as we are talking with St. Joshi on Spaced Out Radio tonight. We're having a fascinating conversation about H.P. Lovecraft. And if you haven't heard this one in full, you're definitely going to want to listen to this show again, because there is so much information that is going on, and ST is just absolutely phenomenal. And thank you, Eric Markham, for being my co-host tonight on this topic, because you're doing phenomenal as well. You're listening to Spaced Out Radio. I am your host, Dave Scott, and of course my co-host Eric Markham. We'll be right back right after this.
The SOR Sightlines is a place for you to find answers to your strange experiences. Hi there, this is Mike Schmidt. If you have had an encounter with ghosts, UFOs, Bigfoot, ETs, or anything else that doesn't make sense, head to spacedoutradio.com and file a Sightlines report. All information you give is 100% confidential, and I will personally help you find the answers you need. SOR Sightlines, your answers are a click away.
Greetings and salutations, space travelers, from the Chronicles of the Unknown team.
What is Chronicles of the Unknown? I keep hearing about this thing.
It's a new paranormal reality TV show based right here in beautiful British Columbia, Canada. Follow our team as we uncover claims of activity on the Caribou Gold Rush Trail. You can also follow us here every third Monday, where two members of our team will be available to answer your questions. We'll give you some equipment updates and some of our experiences on the road, right here on Spaced Out Radio.
Hi there, I'm Butch Witkowski, lead investigator with the U4COP. On the final Monday of every month, you can listen to me and host Dave Scott on Spaced Out Radio's Strange Days. We're going to get to the heart of the matter when it comes to what's happening out there. People are seeing and experiencing things from ET contact to Bigfoot, and I want to hear about it. Your experiences are what we investigators need to help solve these unknown mysteries. So tune in at spacedoutradio.com to the final Monday of every month from Butch Witkowski's Strange Days.
Visit purpleplates.com today. For over 40 years, the Purple Energy Plates have been delivering amazing results for their many customers. Inspired by the great genius Nikola Tesla, the harmony, healing, and energetic effects of the plates have proven over and over to be beneficial and often miraculous to thousands of customers. With their money-back guarantee and the many benefits, how can you afford not to get one? Check their site for daily specials and choose from their many energy products. You won't be sorry. Visit them today at purpleplates.com for mind, body, and spirit, and expect a miracle.
This is your medium, Joanna, from Spaced Out Weekend, 2 mediums and a large. I would love it if you would come and join us with host James Tyson every other Sunday on Spaced Out Weekend. Together, we will take your calls and your questions live. Our goal is to provide you with a positive outlook on deep questions that you may have. Questions regarding love, relationships, money, or whatever else is on your mind. Come and check us out at spacedoutradio.com.
Have you checked out the SOR Spacewire at spacedoutradio.com yet? Every day we post the latest stories regarding the weird, strange, and completely unbelievable. From cryptid and UFO sightings to the conspiracy world, we tackle it all. Hi there, I'm Eric Markham, Spaced Out Radio's news director for the SOR Spacewire. And if you have a story, I want to hear it. Email me at news@spacedoutradio.com.
Patrolling the Pacific Northwest, we are always on the lookout for the strange and unassuming stories that real people are experiencing. Hi, I'm Vincent Zunza from Pacific North Weird. Me and Alexandra Sullivan have teamed to bring to you those odd stories that never seem to make it into the mainstream. Stories so weird that will leave you scratching your head wondering, is this real? It's as real as it gets with Pacific North Weird. You can watch our videos right here at spacedoutradio.com.
Become more intimate and interactive with Spaced Out Radio. Join our Space Travelers Club with your new membership. For $5 a month, we'll provide you with special access to the website, monthly prize draws from books to psychic readings, along with monthly newsletter, private interviews, and more. Sign up today to be part of Spaced Out Radio's experience.
Every month on Spaced Out Radio, we look into the deep and dark reports of cryptids roaming around the world with me, Rob Morphy from Cryptopia.us. I would love it if you would join me and host Dave Scott as we delve into the most arcane stories and reports regarding creatures of the unknown. My job is to hunt down the details and bring the evidence forward to you. These aren't your regular Bigfoot stories I'm talking about either. You can find out more about crypto history at spacedoutradio.com.
Looking for a place to advertise at a very reasonable cost? Look no further than Spaced Out Radio. SpacedOutRadio.com has an advertising tab that you can click to check out our daily, weekly, and monthly packages to play on the radio, or our website including social media. From commercial spots to banners, we have it all. Check out our competitive pricing today.
You hear footsteps in the empty room above you. A rocking chair begins rocking by itself. Don't be afraid of the things that go bump in the night. Reach for Spirit Storybox, the iPhone app the Huffington Post UK called the only ghost hunting app you will ever need. Spirit Storybox. The spirits are telling their stories. Are you listening?
Strange creatures lurking in the night, the sounds of wood knocking in the forest, odd happenings right out of a fictional world. These are the reports I love. Hi there, this is author Ronald Murphy, and I would love it if you join me and Spaced Out Radio host Dave Scott the second Wednesday of every month on our journey into the unknown land of cryptozoology at spacedoutradio.com. From Mothman to Frogman and everything in between. Hey, they don't call me the crypto guru for nothing.
Did you know that Spaced Out Radio runs 7 days a week? Hi, it's James Tyson from Spaced Out Weekend. Every Saturday and Sunday night, starting at 9 p.m. Pacific, midnight Eastern, you can join me and my guests for some great chatter about what's going on out in the universe, or even in that dark part of the basement you really don't want to go back into. Well, let's find the answers to your experiences together. So come on up to Uncle Jimbo's cabin on the weekend. For more information, look us up at spacedoutradio.com.
Would you like to connect with us on Spaced Out Radio? Head to spacedoutradio.com to check out the latest shows, guests, and sponsors. And don't forget to sign up for the Space Travelers Club. You'll find all you need at spacedoutradio.com. Welcome back to Space Out Radio tonight. I am your host, Dave Scott. Good to have you along for the ride tonight. It's always an enjoyable time when we do this show. Tomorrow night on the show, we're talking about the CIA's involvement in narcotics. John Potash will join us. He is an author. We get going at 9 p.m. Pacific, midnight Eastern Time on the mighty SOR. I highly hope you tune us in. If you're listening in on the United Public Radio Network live on 107.7 FM in New Orleans and 160 plus countries around the world, it's really good to have you along for the ride with us. Enjoy your time because we're enjoying broadcasting live to you. If you're listening in on Revolution Radio, thank you so much. And remember, the Double R Machine is a donation station financed by you, the valued listener. Do us a favor, visit freedomslips.com and donate today. Bill Cardwell has set the password in the SOR Space Travelers Club for the night. Immunoelectrophoresis is your password. Immunoelectrophoresis is your password. We thank you, Bill, for setting the password each and every single night here for the SOR Space Travelers. If you want to follow us on Twitter, you can do so at Spaced Out Radio. Give our Facebook page a like, Spaced Out Radio Show. On Instagram, I can be followed at Dave Scott, SOR. Subscribe to our YouTube channel, Spaced Out Radio Show. Tune us in on TuneIn. Download this show and others on iTunes, and our website is spacedoutradio.com. Of course, if you check out our website, we have a plethora of great features to pass along your way, and I hope you check it out, including joining the SOR Space Travelers Club. It's only $5 a month, and we give you some really cool swag, some really cool features as well. Hope you check it out today. Tonight we are talking with author S.T. Joshi. His website is stjoshi.org. We are talking about the legendary writer H.P. Lovecraft, and it's been an incredible show indeed. We are also joined by the SOR Spacewire's Eric Markham, who happens to be a giant H.P. Lovecraft fan. Gentlemen, welcome back.
Hi, Dave.
Good to be here.
ST, when you started researching this, and you've literally learned everything you possibly can about H.P. Lovecraft. Granted, he died 70 plus years ago, 80 plus years ago. Is there still information that is unknown still coming out about him?
Oh, you better believe there is. One of the more insane projects that I've undertaken is, as I mentioned before, the publication of all of Lovecraft's surviving letters. I mean, insofar as I can get them. I mean, there's some that I know are out there that I can't get, but no matter. My colleague David E. Schultz in Milwaukee and I have been editing these letters for the last 5 or 10 years. This project will take 25 volumes, and I just hope I live long enough to see the end of it. And we will get something like 4, 5, 6,000 of Lovecraft's letters into print. I mean, the total wordage of this stuff comes to like 4 or 5 million words. And remember, this is only what survives. He must have written countless millions more words that don't even survive anymore, because he wrote, 80, 90, 100,000 letters. Nobody knows exactly how many, but just a staggering number of letters. And I'll tell you, as I look at this stuff and I stumble upon little bits, something nothing major necessarily, but always providing some little insight that you didn't know before. It's just fascinating. I mean, you mentioned at the beginning of the show my biography, H.P. Lovecraft: A Life. I actually wrote. That's actually a cut-down version of the full-length biography that I wrote at that time, and then it got published in 2010 under the title "I Am Providence: Life and Times of H.P. Lovecraft," and that was like 1,200 pages. And yet there's still more detail that I could have gone into, because these letters are just, they're a literary treasure. I mean, in some ways, they're Lovecraft's greatest accomplishment. I mean, he wouldn't have thought of them as such because he just tossed them off and, sent them around. But you learn so much about this guy. I mean, in a sense, you learn, he becomes more of an icon in these letters than in his fiction, because he's just, it's an amazing personality that comes out of them.
I remember that I've heard an interview with a biographer. I don't know if it was you or not. It might have been. It was, if you've ever done an interview on NPR, it might have been you.
Mm.
And they were talking about how he was an anti-Semite as a rule, or, he didn't like foreigners as a rule, but there were friends of his that fell into the category of outsider, Jew, and he would justify it by saying, well, yeah, he's a Jew, but he's not that, he's our kind of people, or, he would always try to make a excuse why he could be friends with this person. I wonder how much of his xenophobia was instilled in him, but how much of it really he carried it as baggage, but he didn't really see the world.
Oh, he never acted upon it. I mean, he would be friends with anybody. I mean, I don't know that he actually had any African Americans as friends, but he knew some African Americans, and certainly a wide spectrum of Jewish people. And I think a lot of his xenophobia was sort of abstract and sort of what's the term I'm looking for?
An affectation. Oh, yeah.
I wouldn't say that. I mean, he was sincerely held because, it was a cultural thing. He wanted to preserve his culture, and he, as I mentioned at the outset of the show, immigrants served as a convenient scapegoat for the changes in culture that he didn't like. And if you put that aside, he actually wrote some very sharp letters, very, very keen analyses of what was going on in society in the 20s and 30s, the advent of technology and mechanization. It was changing everybody's whole understanding of life and society. We were abandoning the agrarian way of life and becoming urbanized and really ruled by machines even then. And Lovecraft didn't like that. He felt that was impoverishing. It was how can the imagination flourish in that kind of environment? And so he tried to cling to the past and lived imaginatively in the past, as a sort of an antidote to what was going on in his time.
Well, he shares that with J.R.R. Tolkien, who, in a way, is a semi-contemporary, though in a different genre and a completely different life. But so much of Tolkien's, he had that love of the Sylvan lifestyle, and he looked upon the developers that were destroying the farmlands in England. That's where he got his orcs from. Mm-hmm. The maggot folk of Mordor were the developers that were destroying the Yorkshire countryside. And I see there's some parallels, even though the two aren't side-by-side comparisons. The same forces were at work in shaping their mythologies.
That's right. So, a lot of weird fiction, horror fiction, tends to be backward-looking because it draws upon old myths and legendary. The vampire, the werewolf, the haunted house, the ghost. These are all old ideas from the dawn of time. But where Lovecraft is innovative is in realizing that a lot of these old motifs don't really work anymore because we know too much about science. I mean, the one way he was not backward-looking was in his understanding of science, because he knew that science was making enormous discoveries in the course of the 19th and into the 20th centuries, and he wanted to keep up to date with them. And he also felt that weird fiction, in fact, literature as a whole, had to keep up with scientific advance, because otherwise it's just not believable. I mean, Lovecraft never used the standard myths of the vampire or the ghost or the haunted house in any of his fiction. On the rare occasions when he did something like it, he always transformed it utterly and made it more scientifically plausible, because he felt that the standard myths simply can't be used in fiction anymore. They're outdated. They don't work to an educated audience. And so he had to do something different, and that's what he did.
Well, like his Reanimator is, to me, I picked up on it when I read it. It's a parody of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein in a lot of ways. Mm-hmm.
Sure.
And the creator gets his just desserts in the end, just like Victor Frankenstein's creation destroys him, so does the Reanimator. Herbert West's, body parts and experiments finally get him in the end, and it's almost like an updated version of Frankenstein.
Yeah, to some degree. Although I've pointed out that there is a fundamental difference in how Herbert West does his reanimation as opposed to how Victor Frankenstein does. Whereas Frankenstein, the scientist, put together a new body from disparate parts of different human beings. Herbert West reanimates whole bodies, through some sort of formula, which is sort of conveniently undefined. But so there is a kind of different way of reanimation going on there. But nevertheless, I think Lovecraft must have had Frankenstein in mind somewhere along the line. But other stories, that's actually a fairly crude and primitive story, and Lovecraft actually felt that it was one of his poorer stories. It was actually written for money. One of the few times that Lovecraft actually wrote a story, kind of on, at an editor's behest. Some friend of his was forming, believe it or not, a humor magazine called Home Brew. It was a really crappy magazine. I'll tell you, a really bad magazine. But Lovecraft, this guy wanted Lovecraft to write this, sort of, over-the-top serial horror story that could be serialized over 6 issues. And it was actually published under the title Gruesome Tales. And this guy, this editor, paid Lovecraft a grand total of $5 per episode. And that was Lovecraft's first professional sale as a fiction writer. But he always held that story in contempt because he says, it was written to order for this guy and it doesn't amount to anything. But his later work is really scientifically very, very compelling. And, you can't say that this is obviously false. In one letter he says, what we have to do now in fiction is to create phenomena that are, how did he put it, that expand rather than contradict what is known of the universe. And that's what a lot of his later fiction does.
So even though he is considered in the horror genre, you can almost make a case for him being a father of science fiction, where it's not just fantasy, but there's a scientific basis for what he's writing. And in a way, he is also, in my eyes, he's a harbinger, if not the father of modern science fiction. He opened the door for people coming behind him.
Without question. In fact, it's funny because, as I mentioned, Color Out of Space appeared in Amazing Stories, which was really the flagship science fiction pulp magazine. That, in fact, people date the founding of the genre of science fiction to 1926, when the first issue of Amazing Stories was published. Another magazine, Astounding Stories, published At the Mountains of Madness and The Shadow Out of Time, which are his other two really fundamentally science fiction-ish stories. Some horror in them, to be sure, but a lot of hard science as well. And a number of later science fiction writers were strongly influenced by these stories. In fact, Fritz Leiber, who was actually a correspondent of Lovecraft briefly, right at the end of his life, end of Lovecraft's life, said, "Yeah, when I read Color Out of Space as a teenager in Amazing Stories, man, I couldn't sleep for weeks." And then when Arthur C. Clarke read the two stories in Astounding Stories, and he said, "Wow, I was totally blown away." And you can see the influence of those two stories upon some of Clarke's later writings, including things like Childhood's End, maybe even 2001: A Space Odyssey. There is a sort of a deep Lovecraft undercurrent there. It's not obvious at all, but it's there definitely. Philip K. Dick unquestionably read Lovecraft too, and some elements entered into his work. So yeah, Lovecraft definitely is an influence on science fiction.
Oh yeah, you got me. I was going to bring up how Arthur C. Clarke, there was a Lovecraftian undercurrent in that we weren't divinely created creatures. We were
exactly the whole idea that aliens are out there and may have had some role in the development of the human race. That's right from The Shadow Out of Time, which is one of those stories that appeared in Astounding.
Oh, no, I just love the fact that Arthur didn't spell it out, and he made You know, it wasn't like this, you know, rapturous being in light. It was a solid obelisk of stone.
Yeah, right.
That was what transformed this tribe of apes into what would become modern man. And I believe just that scene where the ape man, they figured out that we can use these bones as weapons, and they become the dominant force in that area. And they throw that, you know, in an ecstasy of violence, the ape man throws that bone up into the air, and we go to the spinning space station. And it's just, you know,
that's one of the great images in all of film. I think. Oh man, that's simply incredible. But yeah, I mean, you know, Clark actually wrote an autobiography called Astounding Days, and that's where he talks about, you know, how much he enjoyed those Lovecraft stories. The funny thing is, some science fiction writers, especially early on, you know, from the 40s, 50s, 60s, didn't like Lovecraft for a lot of reasons, particularly because of his prose. A lot of people criticize Lovecraft's prose, very dense prose. I actually think he's a master of English prose in the sense that every word counts. I mean, he knew what he was doing. I mean, he had a tremendous vocabulary, and he you know, he uses words with incredible precision to convey exactly what he wants to convey. But the prose is dense and at times a little hard to read. You know, it's not simple prose by any means. Science fiction, especially the so-called science fiction of the Golden Age, you know, people like Heinlein and the early author Asimov, tend not to write in that kind of idiom. Their prose is fairly straightforward and a little much simpler than Lovecraft's. And so they reacted rather in a hostile way to Lovecraft. In fact, Isaac Asimov is on record as calling Lovecraft a sick juvenile. I don't know what that means even, but he did not like Lovecraft at all, and I don't see a whole lot of Lovecraft in his work. But I think nowadays more and more science fiction writers are responding to Lovecraft. People like, you know, even William Gibson, there's Lovecraftian elements in there, and a number of other writers today really, you know, hold Lovecraft in high esteem.
Oh, like Lumley and his whole vampire, necroscope.
Right. Well, you know, Lumley started out as a frank imitator of Lovecraft. I mean, he was a pure horror writer, you know, for a good part of his career until he started writing those, you know, this kind of the space vampire type stuff. I personally don't care for a lot of Lumley's Lovecraftian writing. I think it's kind of mechanical and a little too obviously imitative. But, you know, he clearly drew upon Lovecraft in that early work. But another writer I was going to mention in this context, I just lost my train of thought here, but yeah, I mean, so the whole science fiction field has been a little ambivalent about Lovecraft, but I think they're kind of warming to him now, as they see him as the important predecessor that he was.
Well, I think they have to tip their hat. Now, you have read his personal letters, which is a privilege I have not yet managed. Did he write his personal correspondence in that same purple prose that he wrote his fiction in, or was he?
Believe it or not, he did. I mean, it's also quite dense. I mean, that which shows you that language came to Lovecraft quite naturally. It was not artificially induced. He didn't sit down and pack as many adjectives as he could in a sentence. I mean, that's just how he wrote. And in fact, the people who met him said he actually spoke like that also. I mean, he spoke in a very erudite manner. It just came naturally to him, you know, through his immense learning, you know, all the books he read over a lifetime, and you know, the devotion he had to learning. I mean, that's, you know, it just came out that way, and so I find that style very natural, you know, having read so much of it. And I think it would have been difficult for Lovecraft to write in any other way. In fact, some stories he tries to write in a sort of more simplified way, like Pickman's Model, he admits was written in a kind of I wouldn't say slangy sort of way, but a little more kind of down to earth. But for that very reason, it doesn't really ring true. It kind of, you know, it seems almost insincere with this first-person narrator narrator, speaking about Pickman in a kind of, down-home kind of way. It doesn't come off. So you see, that style is not natural to Lovecraft, whereas that dense, rich prose is. And I personally can't get enough of it. I mean, it's a lot of people over the years, especially a lot of mainstream critics who really don't understand horror literature, didn't like that style because during the course of the 20s, 30s, 40s, and even later on, a lot of mainstream critics said, "Oh, you can't write that way. You have to write like Ernest Hemingway. Pare down everything to the bare bones, and then just let the reader fill in the gaps." Well, that's a fine way of writing. Okay, you can do it that way, but that's not the only way to write. There's a long tradition of this, dense, rich prose going all the way back to, the 15th, 16th century, and any number of great writers have written in that prose. And Lovecraft, of course, derived it initially from reading Edgar Allan Poe, who writes in that same vein. But he also got it from a lot of the writers of the 18th century whom he really loved, like Samuel Johnson and Edward Gibbon. So that style was imbued in him from a very early period in his life, and so it can't be regarded as artificial.
Right. He read so much of the Poe, the Algernon Blackwoods, the Lord Dunsany, who also wrote in that word dense style. I mean, about the most lighthearted thing you find with Lord Dunsany is how Duth would have practiced his art upon the Knolls, which is written in it's still that purple prose, but it's written in a more lighthearted manner. But it still stays true to itself. Whereas, like you say, when H.P. tried to write in a style less dense, you could tell that he wasn't in his comfort zone.
Right.
And when I read The Reanimator, I thought, okay, this is one of the later stories of his I read. I'm like, God, this isn't even like reading H.P. Lovecraft. You could tell this was like, okay, I've got so many pages I have to submit. I'm going to fill in, I'm going to do a word count. It's almost like, okay, 999. Okay, it's done. He didn't.
That's right. I mean, that story, he had to write very specific requirements. I mean, each episode had to be about 2,000 words, and there had to be a punch at the end of each episode because, as if it appeared, one per issue, you had to leave the reader, with this big, kind of jolt at the end, so they'd want to read the next one when it came out the next month. And Lovecraft realized that was totally artificial. It was totally contrary to any sort of, idea of how to write a short story. And so, I mean, he did it, for the sake of all the $30 that he got for writing that story, but he didn't want to do that again.
Yeah, you could tell his heart was not into that. And, he always put the hook into the story. He wrote to a point. And there was you had your denouement and you had your dramatic, the way he wrote so classically does not lend itself to this serial, if he had written Herbert West Reanimator as a solo piece, it would never have sold in that magazine because there would not have been that artificial cliffhanger or that punch.
Exactly. In fact, he suffers some rejections from Weird Tales, particularly, but also from other magazines, precisely because his work didn't fit into this, the formula-driven nature of the pulp magazines. I mean, the bitterest blow to his whole career came when, at the Mountains of Madness, this incredible novel written in such great detail about, this Antarctic expedition and the horrors they encounter there. I mean, really, to my mind, his masterwork of fiction got rejected by Weird Tales because, as the editor said, well, it's a very long story. It's like 40,000 words. I can't publish it all in one issue. That's way too much. And it can't be divided up into a serial because, there's nowhere to cut it. You can't break the momentum here. And so the editor just said, sorry, I can't publish this. And Lovecraft was crushed. I mean, he was crushed. He said, I put so much into this story, and the magazine that I thought was, my one stable market, slashed me in the face. And, he said that basically ended my career as a writer. I mean, he kept on writing, obviously, for the next 5 or 6 years, but he only wrote like 1 or 2 stories a year thereafter because he was just so disheartened. And others, he got rejected, some other stories. Shadow of Innsmouth got rejected by Weird Tales for the same reason, because, it's also a very long story and nowhere to cut it, without destroying the whole fabric of the story. And, Lovecraft basically outgrew the pulp market and had nowhere else to go, because he couldn't get books published. The mainstream magazines weren't going to publish this stuff. The pulps were rejecting him. What is he going to do?
And there wasn't a book market like there is now for that genre. You can see the passion and the research he put. I just finished literally yesterday rereading the At the Mountains of Madness. I probably read that story at least 5 or 6 times in my life. And as I mature and gain knowledge, there's a few things we found out about Antarctica that have been disproved that he wrote about, but for that period of time, it's almost as relevant now and as believable now as it was back then.
Yeah.
He got this incredible, he couldn't foresee that we would have mapping satellites that would, explore an entire continent from space down to, ice crystals on a mountaintop. So that was a whole fertile area. Nobody knew that much about Antarctica. People died trying to go to Antarctica and explore. One of the most famous explorers in history is actually known for being an astounding failure. Sir Ernest Shackleton, who got there, and he didn't lose anybody coming back, but it's epic. So you have this unexplored continent that you could people with an unknown race, a mountain range that doesn't exist as it's written, but despite what knowledge has come forth since, reading it from a 21st century point of view, I'm reading that saying, this is still a plausible story.
Yeah, it's totally believable. And, Lovecraft had been fascinated with the Antarctic since he was like 10 years old. I mean, because 1900, when he was 10, that's when Antarctic exploration was starting up again after a fairly long interval where nothing really had happened. Back in the 1840s, there had been some attempts to get to Antarctica. I'm not even sure they got there, but they came kind of close. And then Lovecraft, knew about those from reading books. But in his own day, he was now starting to, look at these people who are actually starting to go back to Antarctica again. And, it was a lifelong fascination with him. And he just, I think he'd been wanting to write a story like that literally for decades, and finally got the chance to do so. He got the inspiration in 1931, spent months writing this story, only to have it rejected, and it was a crushing blow to him.
Well, that would be like if, say, Da Vinci presented the Mona Lisa, and they were like, I mean,
yeah, but
he put so much of
and
himself into that. And you can tell he researched the hell out of it because the idea
he had a lot of books about Antarctica in his own library. Obviously, he followed the Admiral Byrd's expedition that started, I think, 1928 or thereabouts, something like that. Byrd did several expeditions, but I think the first one was 1928. And those, there were, I guess he sent cables or something back, to the newspapers. He read the New York Times. So Lovecraft was very much up on Admiral Byrd's expedition. And in fact, at one point, so he wrote the story in 1931, and it didn't get published in 1936. And in that interval, some further exploration had been done that actually had disproven one of the theories he had thrown out there. He had conjectured in the first draft of the story that the Antarctic continent might actually be 2 continents, separated by a frozen sea. Well, apparently that had been disproved around 1935, and Lovecraft was intent on fixing that mistake in his draft. So he got the typescript of his story back from, he had lent it out to somebody, he got it back, apparently revised the story, and only then did it get into Amazing Stories that way. And it's interesting about Amazing Stories, or Astounding Stories. You can gauge how, even though Lovecraft never had a book published in his lifetime, he was still, a figure to be contented with. I mean, he was well known in the pulp field, because when this young guy named Julius Schwartz, who was acting as Lovecraft's agent, took this story, Amounts of Madness, to the editor of Astounding Stories in late 1935, I think it was, and said, "Hey, I have this short novel by H.P. Lovecraft. Do you want it?" And the editor said yes, without even reading the story, because he felt that Lovecraft's name alone would be enough to guarantee, a readership for that story. Now, in the end, when the story got published, in a 3-part serial, the reaction was a bit mixed. I mean, some people loved the story, other people didn't like the story because they felt it wasn't really a science fiction story. I mean, I think they had pretty fixed ideas of what science fiction was at that time, and the idea of a Shoggoth was somehow apparently contrary to science fiction. But whatever. The point is that this editor at Astounding, basically accepted this story, and I think also The Shadow Out of Time, without reading the stories, just because Lovecraft's name was on them.
Yeah, that's such a dichotomy. Here's a guy living in poverty, but on the same token, his name alone sold the book. What I always found, with changing track a little bit, that H.P. Lovecraft had this fascination with cats in his fiction. You've read his letters. Did he have like a companion animal or a cat that he was particularly fond of?
Well, okay, there's a lot I could say about that, but yeah, he had one pet cat in his lifetime. That was when he was a kid. He was born at this big house at 454 Angel Street in Providence, Rhode Island. This cat, I'm sorry to say, had a very politically incorrect name that I cannot utter on this show.
Oh, I know. Okay,
it's the same name that he uses in The Rats in the Walls for the cat in that story. It's a black cat. You can just kind of imagine what that name is. So we cannot say that name. But nevertheless, it was not an uncommon name for a black cat, let's be honest. That's what people name black cats. Anyway, no matter. He had this black cat. He loved this cat as a kid. I mean, it was his life, just companion day and night. When the family suffered this financial problem and in 1904 and had to move to smaller quarters, literally just kind of up the street at 598 Angel Street, smaller house nevertheless, that cat ran away. And Lovecraft never saw it again, and he was heartbroken. And he swore he would never own a cat again because he didn't want to go through that kind of pain of having a cat die on him or run away or something like that. He loved other people's cats, but he really became a lifelong devotee of cats and wrote a number of stories like The Cats of Ulthar and The Rats in the Walls and some other stories that either are entirely about cats or have cats as more interesting characters than the human characters in the story sometimes. And in real life, he just worshipped cats. He wrote a hilarious essay called Cats and Dogs, in which the dog does not come out very well in comparison to the cat. In fact, basically he says at one point, the dog is a peasant, the cat is a gentleman. And that kind of sums up his attitude.
Yep. I think part of when he wrote Cats of Ulthar, where the traveling show is moving through the town, and the little boy's cat is just vanishes, and I see that as almost this young man so attached. The only thing he's got in his life is that kitten. I always felt like that was an autobiographical moment hidden within the framework of his fiction.
Oh yeah, there's no question. I mean, the heartbreak that little boy feels exactly what Lovecraft felt when he lost his cat. And I know I love cats too, and I've had to go through the deaths of a few cats, and it's tough. It's very tough. It's like losing a child. And
yeah. But yeah,
no, he's and his letters. They're so delightful. They're full of little mentions of cats. In 1933, he moved to a little boarding house, actually very close to the campus of Brown University. In fact, it was owned by Brown. That was the last residence he lived in, and across the street was another boarding house where these bunch of cats from the neighborhood would sun themselves on top of a shed, in the backyard of this boarding house, and he became real great friends with these cats, and kind of had them over to his place, and they'd just play around and knock his pen around as he was trying to write, and he was just he was in his element with cats. He had a real bond with cats, and it really kind of humanized him in many ways. I mean, Lovecraft oftentimes can seem kind of a cold fish, certainly as far as women are concerned, but this love he had of cats is very heartwarming.
And that always comes out in his fiction, because the cats are never the villain.
Right.
The cats are always the hero, and the cats of Althar, after the kitten disappears, that couple that lived on the outskirts of town that were sort of outcasts, nobody hears from them for a while. And in retrospect, they realize, after that kitten disappeared and all the cats disappeared, they sort of laid around the house like they weren't hungry.
Yeah, they were all licking their chops,
Yes, they had eaten the foul couple that would kill any cat that came across their property. They got their comeuppance. And, the other one where there was this tremendous battle between these horrible creatures and the cats. And, of course, his cats could communicate in that story. And I think that kitten comes up again because, it was a general in the cat army type thing. It's whimsical and kind of out of character with the way he wrote other stuff.
Right.
But he makes it work because his passion for the animal, I believe, comes through.
Yeah, in fact, that story you referred to is the Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath, where, Lovecraft asked the question, well, where do cats go at night? Well, of course, they have to go to the other side of the moon. I mean, where else? And that's where these cats have this encounter with these horrible moon beasts, as he calls them, and then has this real, a literal war between the cats and the moon beasts, and of course the cats prevail, and Randolph Carter, who's the main character of the story, is with them and helps them, and so the cats have to take him back to Earth, and they take him leap from the moon back to the Earth and carry Randolph Carter on their backs, all the way back to Earth, and it's such a delightful scene. I'd love to see that. Either as a live action or maybe an animated movie. I think that would work really well.
I think modern animators are missing a trove, because you can do things in animation that you can't do live action.
Well, or unless it would cost a fortune,
They would, yeah. Even with computer graphic illustrate CGI, and I don't know how well it would translate. Because so much of the way H.P. Lovecraft wrote was for the theater of the mind, and I don't think it would be epic to try and turn one of his novels into a faithful rendition and get the entire. It's going to take a genius filmmaker to do something like that. Because there's just much imagery.
The work that it's very dense, but it's also there's a lot going on. I mean, he gets so much into such a small space. That's why he really never wrote a full-length novel. I mean, the longest work of fiction he wrote is The Case of Charles Dexter Ward, which is about a little more than 50,000 words. Now that's the size of, say, The Great Gatsby. I mean, people wrote novels of that length at that time. We tend to write much longer novels nowadays. But that's about it. And one of the problems he had getting a book publisher to consider his work or to accept his work was he had no book-length work to offer them. He got in touch with, I think, Simon & Schuster around 1930. In fact, the famous editor Clifton Fadiman, a well-known editor of the time. And Fadiman wrote to Lovecraft saying, "Hey, do you have anything to say, to offer to me?" And Lovecraft said, "Well, I haven't written anything. I don't have a novel." He had the Case of Charles Dixon Ward written, but he didn't think it was a good enough work to submit. In fact, he never even typed up the story. It was laid in handwritten manuscript until after his death. But he said, "Well, I have a bunch of short stories," and Fadiman said, "I'd really like a novel, guy. I mean, short stories don't sell so well, book of stories. So if you just buckle down to writing a novel," but Lovecraft never did. So there we are.
And in the case of that particular story, the length of it, his writing, he could get it done. He could tell this rich tale in a short story. You can tell when you read the Case of Charles Dixon Ward that he was, to me, it feels like he was lost at places and had to kind of double back to pick up. To me, his writing style didn't really lend itself to a full-length novel. Even reading,
because he was not big on character. Okay, let's be honest. The human characters didn't interest him because that was not the focus of his story and not the focus of his imagination. He says the real characters in my stories are the phenomena, are the weird events that actually happen. The human figures are only meant to sort of, carry the narrative along and sort of be the reader's eyes, through which you see what's going on here. So the human figures don't really, aren't of any great importance. And that's, that makes writing a novel very difficult. You can do that in a short story or even a sort of novella-length story, but it's very hard to write a full-length novel just based on phenomena and rather than human beings. So,
his characters are flat. I mean, you have the scientist, you have the intellectual, the foil, you have the aristocracy, you have the peasant,
right?
And you don't really get into too much background. There's no development of the human character. He puts all his passion and all his description, like you said, into what they are experiencing. They are the vehicle that he carries the event on the shoulders of. They are not so much. You can do silent films of H.P. Lovecraft's work because you really don't have to have that much character development.
Right. Or dialogue. There's very little dialogue in Lovecraft stories also.
It's mostly narrative of the event. There's very little. Mountains of Madness, I don't think that's all told in a past tense. This is what happened. Right. It's not a dialogue.
There's not a single bit of dialogue in that story. Not one, I don't think.
No. It's alluded to.
Amazing.
But he carries
exception, or a couple exceptions to this. Lovecraft used the first person a lot, and that's fine, because, again, the first person allows the reader to sort of see what the narrator is seeing. Okay, so that's one thing. But in a story like The Shadow over Innsmouth, there is significant development of that character. Here's this guy who's actually a very young man. He goes back to this old town of Innsmouth, theoretically for sort of genealogical purposes, because he knows his ancestors came from there. He kind of wants to look around, and he likes going to old places. And he, encounters these horrible fish creatures and whatever else, and spends a great deal of time escaping from them and gets out of there, only to realize that he himself is going to become one of those fish creatures because he has that in his ancestry. And what does he do? He goes back to Innsmouth and says, all right, this is my home, and I'm going to go and, and basically go jump into the sea and live in that undersea realm of the deep ones. That transformation of the narrator from being, terrified of these creatures to realize that he's one of them is an incredibly poignant moment. And having it done through the first person means that every reader undergoes that transformation also. And that can be very powerful. So that's the one area where I think Lovecraft does have something to do with character development.
When I read that the first time, I've been reading H.P. since I was 12 or 13. My mom was a librarian, and she kind of think Dreams in the Witch House might have been the first thing. And I was fascinated with with Brown Jenkins, the little rat familiar.
Yes.
And that made me read more. And when the guy gets to that realization that, oh my God, I can't look at these as other because I'm part of this.
Mm-hmm.
That actually, for a young man, and I was always an avid reader. Once I got into the first sentence, I'm not aware of anything going on. I see what's going on in my mind. That shook me up.
Mm-hmm.
That moment, it's like I kind of had to put HP down for a little while after that one, because I think that was the first story I ever read that had that kind of emotional impact on me.
Mm-hmm.
I can read it now now that I'm 53, I can read it now and see it in a totally different way. But for the young reader I was then, that moment was very, very poignant. You're right.
No, I've encountered a fair number of people over the years, who are not really devoted horror readers, but nevertheless, I asked them, "Oh, have you read Lovecraft?" And they said, "I can't read him. He's too disturbing. I mean, he shakes me up. I mean, he can really have that kind of effect on you, even as an adult, and not just as a kid." So there's something really disturbing about his work. Especially those later narratives where they're so rich. 50, 60 pages doesn't seem like much, but for him, that's like a whole novel by somebody else, because there's so much in there that you can get out of it. And it takes you into this whole world, and you live in that world for the duration of that story, and it can really shake you up.
Well, his whole bleak outlook in that we are just an accident of evolution. We are the creation of a science beyond our current knowledge. There's nothing after this. It's just, that bleakness of his mythos. Just there's no hope. Why be good? Why wouldn't you become a frog monster or what? There's no downside.
There's no salvation in Lovecraft, definitely. I mean,
exactly.
Yeah.
Well,
I mean, to some degree, that's actually his attraction, because it's so refreshing to encounter that kind of bleakness. You don't really find that in a lot of literature. A lot of literature has sort of happy endings, and a lot of film and TV have happy endings, but there's no happy endings in Lovecraft. I mean, it's
other than where the cats win the war against the Moon Beast, and of course the Moon Beast is probably more. Dunsany wrote a lot about the Gibberlings, I believe. I think the story was Horde of the Gibberlings. The Gibberlings lived on the moon and trapped humans with their treasure and took them back to the moon to eat. I see that's one of those Dunsanian elements. And you can tell that's not the most mature of his stories.
Yeah,
but when he
that's
gets
an early
into
story, but delightful as it is, but
it is the whimsy. But whimsy doesn't play that. He has a hard time, to me, with whimsy, in that he's always so bleak that
it's
you don't
a little
expect
heavy-handed.
whimsy.
That's all I can say. I mean, Dunsany. If you read Dunsany, he's actually very light. His prose is not nearly as dense as you might think it is. It's just beautifully expressed. I think Dunsany is another master of English prose, very different from Lovecraft, but as much a master as Lovecraft is in his own way. I just wish Dunsany were read much more widely than he is. I think he's really one of the great writers of English literature. But Lovecraft always was a little heavy-handed in his imitations of Dunsany in those early stories. Probably because he couldn't really suppress his own, point of view. He never wrote really straight pastiches. He was too original a writer for that. I mean, he modeled some of his stuff on Poe, some of his stuff on Dunsany. Later on, he read Arthur Machen and was influenced by him. But really speaking, I mean, he absorbed all these influences, and they became part of him and part of his own idiom as he went along.
Yeah, the lexicon he used would lend itself to that bleakness. Where Dunsany, one of my favorite of Dunsany's is how Newth would have practiced his art upon the knolls, where you go through this whole patient. This is the patience of this master burglar, in that he takes an apprentice merely to find out one more secret about the House of the Knowles. It's like, once his apprentice is captured and, you assume, eaten by the Knowles, he's like, I didn't know about, he took, he made note of how that kid, and you get the impression he's not going to give up on getting into the House of the Knowles and stealing their stuff. However many apprentices he has to bring through, he's going to have cannon fodder that he throws at that house until he gets there. And
the Lovecraft Dunsany relationship is actually quite interesting. Because, Lovecraft actually saw Dunsany lecture in Boston in 1919. Dunsany was going on this big American tour because he was hugely popular. I mean, immensely popular in a way. I mean, he was almost like the Beatles in some ways at that time. I mean, there were 5 productions of his stuff, of his plays on in New York at the same time in 1916, I think it was. I mean, you can't imagine how popular Dunsany was, and now he's, largely forgotten, unfortunately. But anyway, so Lovecraft saw him in 1919, and in lecturing in Boston, and then started reading all his stuff, and read just about everything that Dunsany had written up to that time, and then started writing these stories. So then what happens? Lovecraft dies. Arkham House starts publishing these collections of Lovecraft stories, and Dunsany reads them. Because there is at least one letter by Dunsany from the 40s written to August Derleth, the publisher of Arkham House, saying, I've read some of these stories by Lovecraft, and they're kind of written in my voice, but they're really his own stories, just using kind of my idiom. So it's incredible to see that Dunsany himself appreciated some of these imitations that Lovecraft wrote of his own work.
Eric, are you still there? Are you still with us? Did we lose Eric? Maybe
he might have.
No, I had a coughing fit, and with Dunsany, he's not as dense. If you read H.P. Lovecraft, put that book down, then read Dunsany, you see the elements that they share. But I don't think Dunsany is, to me, he doesn't read as densely or as labored,
right,
as H.P. Lovecraft does.
Yeah, but I think they both wrote great prose, but they're actually substantially different. I think Dunsany was a master of metaphor. That's what you read Dunsany for.
Yes.
And symbol, and I mean, really, they're just, both of them are great writers in my estimation, but quite different in their general outlooks.
You have to juxtapose the fact that at his heyday, Dunsany's a rock star, at the same time that H.P. Lovecraft is beavering away in obscurity. Now you bring up Lord Dunsany to people, and you get this blank look.
Yeah.
Like you've got fish coming out of your mouth, but you can mention H.P., and now he's the rock star.
I know, it's been a total turnaround. And in fact, a lot of these other writers, like Dunsany, Mackin, Blackwood, we read now because of Lovecraft. And I certainly did. I mean, I would never have heard of these writers if Lovecraft hadn't written about them, in supernatural horror and literature. Maybe I would have discovered them later, but that's when I first, learned about these writers. And that's and a lot of these writers have their work is getting reprinted now also, but chiefly kind of as a subset to Lovecraft. It's very odd how this has happened.
And so
but it
much
just goes to show how Lovecraft's influence has spread so far and wide.
And so much of it is public domain. I mean, you can go to, I think it's LibriVox or something, and all that stuff is, it's public domain. Blackwood and Dunsany, and there's no recognition. It's
well,
it's
I mean, I think each of these writers does have kind of a core audience. I mean, they have kind of their own fan clubs or devotees. Some of them, more in England than over here. But I think they all are rewarding. I mean, not only just because Lovecraft liked them, but they are genuinely good or even great writers in their own right, and well worth reading. You you can't really understand the whole development of weird fiction from Poe up to today unless you read all these guys, Lovecraft, Mack and Dunsany, Blackwood, M.R. James, Walter de la Mare, I mean, so many others. It gives you really have to read this whole spectrum of writers to get an understanding of what's going on now in horror fiction.
Gentlemen, I have to start wrapping things up. St. Joshi on H.P. Lovecraft. You're incredible, my friend. You are absolutely incredible. Eric, you were fantastic, too. Gentlemen, you hold on for 1 second. I'm going to wrap this thing up. I didn't have to do much tonight. Eric Markham just kind of pushed me to the wayside. A nice clean body check with the shoulder up, the elbows down, stick down as well. And I just went off to the ice. That's just the way it goes. Tomorrow night on the show, I do want to remind you, John Potash will join us. We're talking the CIA, drugs, their involvement in Black Ops, 9 p.m. Pacific, midnight Eastern Time, tomorrow night at spacedoutradio.com. Once again, if you want to view St. Joshi's website, just go to stjoshi.org. That's Joshi. Thank you, everyone, for listening in on the Space Out Radio chat room on Spreaker, on Revolution Radio, UPRN, the SOR Space Travelers, and our newfound love on Twitter, hashtag Spaced Out Radio. We're going to do this all again in 21 hours from now. I hope you join us. Take care, everyone. Have a good night.